Chapter 937. The hustle and bustle would eventually come to an end. 2 days after the surging waves, it was noon in Shanghai City. The weather wasn't very good. Although it couldn't be considered dark clouds, it was still gloomy and gloomy. There wasn't the slightest bit of sunlight, making it very gloomy and depressing. If this continued, a night rain would be inevitable. However, this didn't affect the atmosphere below. With Shanghai City's southern square as the center, countless people continuously crowded in from all directions. The clamor quickly heated up the atmosphere here. It was like a grand festival, a ceremony, or the arrival of some important figure. In short, around lunchtime, more and more citizens were like fish that smelled spices, gathering here and filling every corner of the square. Anger, agitation, suspicion, as well as expressions that were slightly distorted due to the faint excitement. Each and every one of their faces had different expressions. Of course, most of them looked like they were here to watch a show, with faint excitement and indifference. Looking from the periphery of the square, in the middle of the increasingly lively sea of people, there was a tall statue of a dark-skinned old man holding a code of law in one hand and a hammer in the other. If they guessed correctly, this should be a famous person in Shanghai City who had been a judge in his lifetime, which was why the citizens had made a statue to commemorate him. Of course, this wasn't the main point. The main point was that below the statue of the judge, there was a simple man-made platform. On top of it was a black and brown log, and the surroundings were covered with dry wood and branches. Around the platform, large groups of garrison cavalry had already rushed over and were maintaining order. They shouted angrily and drove the crowd back to make room for the statue. But even so, there were still countless busybodies who peeked inside from the shoulders of the cavalrymen, the gaps between the cavalrymen, or under the spears. Then, they turned their heads and shouted what they saw to the back, as if it was a live broadcast. "It's all wood, it's all wood. When it's lit, that depraved woman will definitely burn up along with the platform. Are you sure it's a fire?" This troublesome child cried, and insisted on coming with me to take a look. "It's good that it's a fire. Once there's smoke, you can't see anything, and there's no blood. What a pity. I heard that woman is rather pretty. Isn't she nicknamed the Flower of Nights? In the end, she's going to be burned to death. What's there to pity? Evil heretics should be burned. Yes, yes, but why hasn't she come yet? Don't tell me it's cancelled. Impossible, wait a little longer. Soon, soon. What a magnificent and cruel scene. Even though they knew that people would be burned to death here, there were still so many people who came to watch. Oh, there's even a family. What psychology! Even in the South City, which was marked by the slums, the crowded square was also a bustling commercial area. Many high-rise shops and lofts were erected around it. Now, in the east of the square, Philip stuck his head out of the floor-to-ceiling window of the 3-story clothing store. He looked down at the square and couldn't help but shake his head and sigh. "You're just here to watch a good show." Ellen stood quietly at the side and watched coldly. She looked at the daughter of the rich neighbor, the young woman who was hugging Philip's arm with a face full of shock. The corners of her mouth curled slightly. "However, it seems that you also brought your family here." This is different. I was forced. I can't help it if she wants to follow me out of curiosity." "Oh dear, I was wrong. I invited you here on purpose. Don't pinch me, don't pinch me." The half of his body that was sticking out of the window shivered and retracted instantly. Philip comforted the young daughter of the rich businessman rather awkwardly and persuaded her to let go. Then, he turned his head to look at Winston, who was scanning the crowd below with narrowed eyes. "I say, if Tang Yin doesn't show up today, what do you plan to do?" "Then I'll watch a good show and continue to wait." As if he didn't notice anything unusual, Winston retracted his gaze and glanced at Allen. "Of course, I may have to ask President Allen to help me invite him when the time comes." Allen's expression didn't change. He wasn't angry and he wasn't surprised. After all, since he was already a captive, He had to have the consciousness of a captive, however. Philip narrowed his eyes when he heard this. I seem to have said that Alan is my friend. Haha, I'll definitely take care of your friend. Then, how about we ask the elders of Josiah's family to come forward? With a chuckle, Winston said casually, choose one of the two. Since I'm already here, you can't let me go back empty-handed, right? I don't mind. Philip turned his head to look out of the window. He put away his usual cheeky smile and said calmly, Winston, don't try to cross my bottom line. Winston looked at Philip in surprise when he heard this, as if he was meeting him for the first time. He then nodded. I understand. If everything goes well, I don't want to do that either. Well, actually, I've always been a little curious. You should be very clear about the relationship between Bran and the Grey Coat Army. Even if he has Master's support, isn't it a little too much for you to be so blatantly biased? Don't tell me it's because of that Josiah. As far as I know, that's your friend Tangen's woman. He waved his hand. What do you mean by yours or his? As long as it's a beautiful woman, she's my potential lover. Ahem, I'm just saying. Looking at Alan's suddenly knife-like gaze, Philip coughed slightly awkwardly. His gaze was a little erratic, but he just happened to meet the suspicious gaze of the rich merchant's little daughter not far away. He could only look at Winston with his body tensed up. I'm very clear about the relationship between Bran and the Grey Coat Army. Perhaps you don't know, but the Grey Coat Army has worked with us before. At that time, we got along quite well. Moreover, you're right. I'm indeed friends with Tangen. Then, since this matter has been handed over to me, it's only right to help a friend, isn't it? Us? Winston sensitively caught the difference in the partners in Philip's words. It's us, not Bran. He raised his eyebrows. You're talking about the new nobles. Could it be that you're still working with the Grey Coat Army? Winston, who was originally from a great noble family, was not very concerned about the family's affairs even though he was under Wu Ding's tutelage. However, the two main factions in the palace, the old nobles and the new nobles, were naturally aware of it. They also knew that Philip had a good relationship with His Royal Highness the Second Prince and was drifting among the new nobles. What a joke. Even if we're willing, the Grey Coat Army of the dead leader Losha won't be willing. Philip shook his head speechlessly. It's just forming good karma. After all, who knows what will happen in the future? It's always good to have an extra route of retreat. Route of retreat? What route of retreat? This time, it was Winston's turn to be speechless. He looked at Philip as if he was looking at a lunatic. Could it be that you new nobles think that the Grey Coat Army can defeat Bran? I didn't say that. But you can't deny that this is also a possibility, isn't it? Moreover, I've realized that you've all underestimated the true strength of the Grey Coat Army. This is not an opponent that can be easily defeated as long as you're serious. At the moment when the northern wilderness tribes are about to invade the border, the existence of the Grey Coat Army cannot be underestimated. If we're not careful, it's hard to say what kind of commotion it will cause. Perhaps you're right. The Grey Coat Army can't defeat Bran. But if at a critical moment, the Grey Coat Army and Bran are in a stalemate, then these accumulated good karma will be an opportunity for negotiation. Of course, these are all hypotheses. Just treat it as if I'm joking. You just need to understand one thing, and that is that my help this time is not entirely out of selfishness. After a moment of silence, Winston still shook his head in disbelief. I still think that you new aristocrats are crazy. There's actually someone who thinks highly of the Grey Coat Army. I'm definitely going to kill Tangen this time. Your plan is destined to be a castle in the air. I've already said that this is a matter for the future. It's boring to talk about it now. Although from a personal point of view, I'm very pessimistic about your plan this time, but if you can really kill Tangen, then you'll really be doing Bran a big favor. Philip shrugged and said calmly, Do you think that no one knows that you've secretly brought an expert over from the capital this time? I'm sure that my old man definitely knows about it, and he also doesn't think highly of you. He just wants you to come over and try. If you succeed, it'll be a surprise, but if you don't, it'll be normal. Anyway, for the sake of the sword god, you probably won't die. Learning a lesson is also a gain. So, after a pause, he patted Wencelin's shoulder, who looked as if he had seen a ghost. Relax. As soon as he finished speaking, with a whoosh, the square outside the window suddenly became lively. Waves of noise rolled, and the slightly gloomy and cold atmosphere seemed to have instantly raised the temperature by a little. Are they here? In the distance, a large group of cavalry in silver-white armor was like a sharp sword out of its scabbard. They directly split the boiling sea of people and slowly came over. P.S. I hesitated for a moment, but still wrote this chapter. The civet cat knows that it will look a little boring and a little baffling, but this is a necessary foreshadowing, and I really can't save the ink. Chapter 938. Just as the three of them were scheming against each other by the window, on the second floor of the restaurant on the north side of the square, a pair of eyes peeked at them. What? So he's here to watch the trial. I had to disguise myself for so long. Anika, who was fully wrapped up, pouted and mumbled in dissatisfaction. Haha, I already said that Alan isn't that kind of person. You're worried for nothing. Betsy, who was pulled along by Anika, shook her head with a smile. She took off her wide-brimmed hat, waved to the waiter nearby, and ordered 2 drinks. Then I'll have to keep an eye on him. Sister Becky, you don't know. Did you see that person with a wretched smile? The one standing on Alan's left. He's Philip, who's been hanging around our house for the past few days. Anika pointed to the 3rd floor of the Oriental clothing store with a look of disdain. Alan has a lot of friends, but he's the only bad one. Do you see that woman standing beside him? She's the daughter of our neighbor's rich merchant. She's usually a proud person, but she's been seduced by Philip in just a few days. Humph, pervert, playboy, shameless. A woman's intuition was terrifyingly accurate. If Alan wasn't here, he would definitely agree with his fiancée's judgment. Pervert? Philip. Betsy, who had a wide range of friends because she was in charge of family affairs, raised her eyebrows. She seemed to have thought of something, and her expression turned strange. But then she shook her head and murmured, "It shouldn't be him. He's active in the capital." What? Oh, nothing. I suddenly thought of someone. After a pause, Betsy said, "Anika, you're also a noble. You should have heard of the Imperial Flower Wolf, right? I heard that his name is Philip, and he's from a prominent family. I've heard of it, but it's definitely not him." Hearing this, Anika shook her head and denied it without thinking. Although his habits are similar, he doesn't have any noble aura from head to toe. How could he be from a prominent family? However, men are all the same. They're all bad. Although her words weren't polite, Anika's words made sense. As long as one was born in a large family and had been in that circle for a long time, one would be able to tell at a glance whether or not one was a noble. Those with good eyesight could even roughly determine the level of the noble families. Annie's eyesight was limited, and she hadn't reached that level yet. But as a noble, if Philip was really of the same class, Anika believed that she would be able to recognize him. However, the reality was that Philip, who had always presented himself as a sloppy person, was far from the elegant temperament of a noble. Of course, this was inevitable. This was mainly because Philip's target this time was the daughter of a wealthy merchant and not a proper noble lady. Otherwise, Anika would have been able to see what a prominent family was capable of when it came to picking up girls. Betsy nodded and didn't mind. Then it shouldn't be him, Before she could finish her sentence, there was an uproar outside the window. The deafening sound directly drowned out Betsy's words. Even Anika couldn't hear it clearly. Startled, the two of them subconsciously turned to look at the square outside the window. Very quickly, they found the center of the uproar. It was a group of temple knights wearing bright silver armor. After a moment, Annika licked her lips and looked dazed. Sister Betsy. She's so pitiful. From the looks of it, Sylvia's current situation was indeed pitiful. The Temple Knights officially entered the square from the north. The Radiant Light Knights did their best to open a path in the sea of people. Following closely behind, a wooden prisoner carriage slowly moved forward. The prisoner carriage's structure was extremely simple. Other than the surrounding wooden frame, there was nothing to hide. Everyone's gazes converged and could easily see a tall white figure sitting cross-legged in the prisoner carriage. This figure dressed in white didn't look dejected like an ordinary criminal parading through the street. Instead, his shoulders and back were straight, like a sharp sword peak piercing through the sky. His long hair was slightly messy because he didn't care about it, but it was obvious that the owner had deliberately pulled it back. His face was bare, revealing a slightly pale but determined face. It was precisely because of this that the tens of thousands of people who had been waiting for a long time instantly recognized the identity of the person in the prisoner carriage and couldn't help but exclaim. The suspicion and disbelief from before were swept away. This was indeed one of the temple's 12 holy knight commanders, the flower of knights, Sylvia. Sylvia's expression was very calm. Her eyes looked straight ahead, like a forgotten lake in a mountain stream. She faced it directly like a mirror, without any ripples. Perhaps it was because this slightly aloof and arrogant attitude was completely different from the embarrassing scene of the holy goddess falling to the mortal world in everyone's imagination. It didn't give them the perverted pleasure that was formed by the difference. Thus, they were enraged. In an instant, the sea of people surged. Bitch! No one knew where the hysterical shouting came from, but it was like a fuse that instantly ignited the atmosphere in the field. Go to hell, damn evil heretic, I used to worship you. Burn her, her filthy soul can only be purified with a raging fire. What are you pretending for? Even a nightingale standing on the street is 100 times cleaner than you. Prostitute, tens of thousands of angry faces, tens of thousands of raised fingers, and spittle flew everywhere. Countless vicious curses swept over like a tsunami, like a storm, directly pressing towards the slightly frail figure in the small prison wagon. It was certain that most of them hadn't said a word to Sylvia face to face, and they hadn't even seen her before. Or, in the past, they had loudly praised Sylvia's good deeds, praised her merits, and even secretly admired her. But now they felt that they had been deeply deceived, although they couldn't confirm whether this deception was true or not. They also felt sincere anger, although they didn't know the source of this anger, but if the people around them were angry, then they naturally had to be angry, curse, and vent their anger. Everyone was pointing fingers at her. Sylvia's expression darkened slightly, and she pursed her lips as if she wanted to say something, but in the end she didn't say anything. She only raised her chin slightly, hid her gloomy expression, and was as resolute as ever. But this seemed to have angered the crowd even more then. Something was thrown from the sea of people, and it hit the wooden pillar of the prisoner carriage with a crisp sound, splashing yellow and white liquid. Some of it landed on Sylvia's white prison clothes, and it was very eye-catching. Most of it landed outside the carriage, and some even flew to the nearest citizen's mouth. She subconsciously licked it. Yes, it was an egg. As if they had been reminded, the people around the prisoner carriage instantly reacted. Thus, in the next moment, smash her to death. Eggs, potatoes, stones, all kinds of vegetables, all kinds of shoes. They all came crashing down like raindrops, and the clanging sounds of impact were incessant, drowning out most of the prisoner carriage in an instant. One could even see a mesmerizing golden parabola amidst all of this. A gold coin? Oh, it must have been thrown by some careless citizen. Now that I think about it, I really regret it. However, you get what you pay for. This gold coin, which was probably the most valuable among all of the things thrown at her, accurately passed through the gaps between the wooden pillars, and quickly hit the corner of Sylvia's eye, below her brow bone. Dong! She subconsciously tilted her head, and the gold coin bounced back, then fell powerlessly, and landed steadily on Sylvia's bent left leg. She lowered her head slightly, and probably because she often played with it, the symbol of the Bran royal family could be clearly seen on the reverse side of the coin. However, in the next second, a drop of blood landed on the gold coin, and the golden symbol was instantly dyed red. Because some kind of restriction had been placed on her body, Sylvia was extremely weak at the moment. Not to mention her divine fighting power, even her innate divine power was restricted, and she couldn't even lift her hand to clean up the debris on her body. And this gold coin, which was flying at a high speed, happened to hit the vulnerable spot above the corner of her eye. In an instant, a small wound appeared on Sylvia's face. Blood trickled down, dripping from the corner of her eye and across her face. It was like tears of blood. Seeing that Sylvia was injured, the crowd suddenly burst into cheers. "Haha, good job! She's bleeding, she's bleeding. Everyone, put in more effort, and directly smash this shameless woman to death." In the midst of the shouting, all kinds of debris fell more densely. Perhaps they were inspired by the gold coin, but this time, there were a lot more coins among the miscellaneous items that were thrown. Of course, they were all copper coins, damn it! Back off! Everyone back off! Go, 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 knights, put up your shields! Seeing that the situation was getting out of control, the team couldn't get close to the trial platform at all. In addition, there were more and more debris on his head, and Harvey, who was unjustly attacked, finally couldn't bear it anymore. He waved his hand and ordered the light knights to stand on both sides of the prison cart and protect it with their shields. In an instant, roars, curses, and all kinds of debris flew at low altitude. For a moment, the scene was chaotic and lively. Phew! Sure enough, it's human nature to watch the fun, and joining in the fun is a deep-rooted bad habit hidden in human nature. Exhaling a turbid breath, Philip shook his head, and the corners of his mouth curled up into a mocking smile. And this group of swindlers, they're really ruthless to their own people. Regarding this trial, from beginning to end, including the grand scene before them, it was all planned and managed by Winston. But it wasn't Winston's idea to let Sylvia ride in such an unobstructed prison cart. Because the team from the Temple of God had just arrived at Songhai City, and then rushed over without stopping. In other words, only the people from the Temple of God had the time to make Sylvia do this. It shouldn't be like this, she's too stubborn. Looking down from a high vantage point, Alan saw the whole process very clearly. It could be said that the reason why the scene was so crazy and chaotic was also because the people were angered by Sylvia's calm expression. We're here to see the criminal being punished, and your indifferent attitude clearly makes us unhappy. It's normal because she's Sylvia. Chapter 939. P.S. It's really not water. Sylvia's character is very fond of raccoons, so I spent more ink on it. That's normal, because she is Sylvia. Philip revealed everything with a single sentence. Indeed, it was Sylvia who was sitting in the prisoner's carriage. It was Sylvia who was indomitable no matter when and where she was. Even if she had to bear the crime of betrayal and be kicked out of the temple, she still wanted to know who was right and who was wrong. She was so unyielding and stubborn to the extreme. Until the facts proved that her insistence was indeed wrong. Otherwise, even if she was condemned by thousands and made an enemy of tens of thousands, how could she be soft and bow her head? Sylvia did not bow her head, but Harvey could not take it anymore. The reason why he deliberately arranged for Sylvia to sit in the prisoner's carriage was that he was angry at Sylvia for blocking his future after failing to persuade her, so he wanted to teach her a lesson. The divine punishment of fire after that was the highlight of the show. He couldn't let Xiao Weian die in the middle then. With the intervention and protection of the temple knights, the prisoner's carriage finally slowly passed through the sea of people, entered the area controlled by the garrison cavalry, and safely arrived at the judgment platform. At this point, the fiery atmosphere finally eased a little. Of course, this was only temporary. Everyone knew what was going to happen next, and those distorted faces with faint expectations, excitement, and other complicated expressions were all patiently and impatiently waiting for the arrival of that moment. At that time, it would be the real climax. With a creak, under the gaze of tens of thousands of people, the prisoner's carriage opened. Sylvia, with all kinds of things still hanging on her body, slowly moved her steps and walked down the carriage. Her image was inevitably a little awkward, but her expression was still as calm as water. Be careful. The unknown restriction was like heavy shackles, pressing down on Sylvia until she was extremely weak. The moment she stepped out of the carriage and stepped on the ground, her body could not help but sway. Seeing this, the young knight at the side subconsciously stepped forward and reached out to steady Sylvia's body. "Thank you." Sylvia was slightly startled, then she gently pursed her lips and said the first sentence with a smile. "This is what I should do, milord." The young knight was a little flustered. He immediately reached out to brush away the leaves hanging on Sylvia's shoulder. However, as soon as he stretched out his arm, it was slapped down by a palm from behind. "Captain, go back!" With a low growl and a glare at the young knight, the knight captain walked over and looked at Sylvia with an expressionless face. After a moment of silence, he straightened his body and performed a standard knight's salute. Then, he stepped aside and made way for the trial platform. Sylvia nodded. She didn't show any resentment. Instead, she also expressed her gratitude. The young knight had crossed the line. Perhaps he really respected Sylvia, but the current situation was not suitable. The captain slapped his arm away, but he was actually helping him. Didn't he see Harvey's face darken? On the contrary, the captain was very experienced. A standard knight's salute could be seen as a form of respect for Sylvia, but it could also be understood as pity and mercy for the fallen. This was in line with the teachings of the Temple of Light. It was completely inappropriate for Harvey to take the opportunity to flare up. Perhaps they were inspired. When Sylvia walked past with difficulty, every Knight of Light lowered the tip of their spear, straightened their body, and performed a standard knight's salute. This also made Harvey's face even gloomier. Of course, he understood the intentions of these knights, but he really couldn't say anything. He could only watch helplessly. He almost suffered internal injuries from holding it in. Without support, without guidance, without any help, Sylvia walked step by step to the trial platform. There was still a distance between the prisoner's carriage and the trial platform. This was also Harvey's bad intention. He was extremely clear about the weight of the restriction placed on Xia Weian's body. He didn't want Xia Weian to walk over so openly. Instead, he wanted her to be like a terrified criminal, trembling as she moved over, crawled over, or even be carried over. This was the behavior of a criminal who knew that her life was coming to an end. But Xia Weian walked very steadily, her eyes looking straight ahead. Each step she took a salute. Under the contrast of the surrounding knights' salutes, the scene suddenly became a little more sacred. It didn't seem like she was walking to the judgment platform, but more like a proud general returning triumphantly to the award platform to receive the honor medal she deserved. Everyone could see that Sylvia was extremely weak now. She would fall at the slightest touch. However, everyone could feel the formless yet majestic aura that had gathered around Xia Weian. It was sacred and inviolable. For a time, the noisy scene gradually quieted down. Harvey, who was standing in the field, and the thousands of people outside the field were all stunned. They only felt an indescribable force pressing on their chests. They opened their mouths blankly and couldn't speak. Hiss! Beautiful! Handsome! This is Sylvia? Sure enough, seeing is believing. So this is King Xia Wei. And gasping, Philip couldn't help but pat the window and stand up. He sighed repeatedly. Then his eyes lit up and he waved his arms. It's this unique feeling of standing out. I think I've really fallen in love with her. Well, to be able to change the topic of heartfelt emotion to picking up girls so naturally and freely, Philip could be considered as one of the unique ones. This unconventional compliment full of Philip's characteristics could be called a weirdo. But after saying it, no one objected, including Wenslin, who was standing at the side. He couldn't object because he was in a trance and didn't hear these words at all. His mind was wandering previously, except for Tang En. Wenslin, who was always arrogant, didn't think that there was a warrior who could compare to him in the younger generation. Including Sylvia, because she was only at the peak of Earth stage and hadn't even touched the threshold of Void stage, she wasn't qualified to enter his eyes. But now, for some reason, looking at the majestic aura surrounding Sylvia, Wenslin suddenly faintly felt that even if he was about to cross the threshold of Void stage, if he were to have a life-and-death battle with this Sylvia, he was afraid that he would be the one to lose in the end. What was going on? How was it possible? Could it be that such a huge gap still couldn't determine the outcome of the battle? At this moment, Wenslin was extremely confused. Although the scene was silent, Sylvia still continued to move forward, and the people present had unknowingly approached the trial platform. They paused for a few moments in front of the steps and looked up at the tall statue standing behind the platform. Then, they lowered their heads and bypassed the dry wood and branches, steadily stepping onto the trial platform step by step. They paused and looked at the dark brown log nailed to the center of the platform, then turned to look at the knight holding the rope in one hand and saluting with the other. Pause for a while, they asked doubtfully, "Not tied?" Then sit down, you can't run away anyway." Shrugging, Sylvia sat cross-legged very naturally, returning to the position in the prisoner carriage. Then, she bowed slightly and slowly breathed a sigh of relief. The shackles were not fake, and Sylvia could walk steadily until here was her limit. If she didn't sit down now, she was afraid that she would really follow Harvey's instructions and make a fool of herself on the spot. At this time, the people in the field finally reacted. Thinking of the strange feeling just now, they were immediately shocked and confused, making a lot of noise. And Harvey's face instantly turned as black as the bottom of a pot, both embarrassed and angry. He was not an ordinary person who didn't know anything, but because he knew more, he was embarrassed. After all, no matter how he looked at the scene just now, it was Sylvia's imposing manner that suppressed the thousands of people in the field, including him, the presiding judge in name. The judge was actually intimidated by the subject of the trial. How big of a joke would it be if this were to spread out? Calming his mind, Harvey didn't bother to pursue the knight, who refused to come forward to tie the rope. He narrowed his eyes and looked at Sylvia with resentment, saying loudly with a fake smile, "Hee, as expected of Lady Sylvia. Even if she has fallen into evil heresy, her unrepentant character still hasn't changed." This sentence could be said to be ruthless. Not only did it directly gloss over the embarrassing scene just now, but more importantly, it defined the meaning of Xia Weian's actions from the moment she entered the trial venue until now. That was, she was unrepentant. And the onlookers who had preconceived notions heard this and realized that it seemed to be the case. They were instantly enraged and echoed with a burst of curses. And seeing that the atmosphere had returned to the right track of the trial again, Harvey smiled even more and shouted in a sentencing manner, "God said, sinners who don't repent don't need to be forgiven. Only by letting them fall to the bottom of the abyss of hell forever, with their filthy bodies being whipped by poisonous vines forever, and their evil souls being tormented by poisonous flames forever, will it be the most benevolent and righteous act for their sins." Pause for a while, amidst the cheers, he asked sarcastically, "Lady Sylvia, do you still remember the doctrine of this code?" This was a process of the trial of the temple. After the crime of the subject of the trial was read out, the presiding judge would randomly pick a suitable passage from the code of the temple and read it out. It could be regarded as the definition and reprimand of the crime, and then the punishment would be carried out. Now, Harvey deliberately skipped the process of reading out the crime and directly carried out the final judgment and reprimand of Sylvia. Well, he was indeed worthy of being the deacon of the court of judgment of the temple. His professional skills were very good. The content that was randomly picked out from the obscure code of the code was read out very smoothly, word for word. Sylvia didn't have this ability. This didn't mean that her faith wasn't firm, but that there were thousands of codes of the temple. It was so vast that even the Pope himself might not have read them all, let alone Sylvia, a combatant from the Department of Knights of the Temple. I don't remember, and I've never heard of it. Sylvia replied indifferently, but I have something to say, and I don't know if the deacon is willing to listen to it. Haha, is it about repentance? Tell me about it. It's about enlightenment. Sylvia raised her chin and looked up at the gloomy clouds in the sky. She slowly said, "During this period of time, I've thought a lot about the doctrine, about my experience, and about what I've done over the years. Then, I began to hate myself. I feel that I'm the stupidest person in the world because I'm so ignorant and full of faith." That makes sense, but isn't this still repentance? Although it was a little uncomfortable to be looked down at from above, at this time, Harvey finally had a sense of superiority as the deacon of the court of judgment. With a faint mocking smile on his face, he officially entered the zone. "But don't you think it's a little too late to repent now? Let me finish, thank you." Sylvia lowered her eyes slightly and looked directly at Harvey with a serious expression. For some reason, Harvey suddenly felt that he was being despised, although Sylvia's gaze was really sincere. She continued, "But now I realize that it's not the case. In fact, the most worthy of my hatred is you, a group of learned people without faith. I pity you." As soon as she finished speaking, Harvey's old face flushed red. It was burning as if he had been slapped in the face. In fact, the situation was more or less the same. Harvey had just shown off his knowledge and talent in front of Sylvia, reciting the contents of the rare code word for word. He was feeling good about himself, but now he had been slapped in the face successfully, and it was from the bottom of her heart. This was even more infuriating. "You won't change." Harvey flicked his sleeves and turned around. His expression was extremely gloomy. He didn't want to talk to Sylvia anymore. He looked directly at the knight holding a torch and screamed, "Execute, burn her to death! Now, immediately!" Yes. Seeing the knight holding the torch close to the dry wood and branches, the atmosphere in the square suddenly became restless. They had waited for so long, wasn't it for this moment? Of course, there were also people who didn't think so. What a pity, such a beautiful woman was burned to death so easily before she could fall into my hands. It's simply too cruel, too. Cough, cough. Pause for a while, he coughed twice and suddenly raised his voice. "It's too exciting. Let me tell you, just based on this trip wasn't in vain." Hearing that, Wenslin turned his head in surprise. He looked at Philip, who had been sighing a moment ago but had suddenly raised his hands in approval. He couldn't help but be speechless. On the other hand, Alan, who was at the side, looked at the palm of the rich merchant's daughter deep in Philip's waist due to the angle. He pursed his lips and had a new understanding of a certain person's moral integrity. And at this moment, with a shrill scream, Philip suddenly jumped up like a rabbit that had been shot by an arrow. "Let go, let go. Didn't I King admit my mistake and change? What else do you want?" God, 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 looking at the rich merchant's daughter who had a dull look in her eyes, her lips trembling, and yet still holding on tightly to the soft flesh on his waist, Philip was instantly enraged. "What God, are you crazy? Let go quickly, or I'll really get angry." "No, no. God, true God." Before Philip could react, the rich merchant's daughter was the first to panic. Her words were jumbled up and incoherent. Alan and Wenslin, who were at the side, saw that something was wrong. They subconsciously followed her line of sight and looked up. Their bodies suddenly stiffened. F***ck. Chapter 940. F***ck. Looking up, not only were Alan, Winston, and the others dumbfounded, but even Philip, who was being pinched by the soft flesh on his waist, forgot about the pain for a moment. His mouth opened into a ridiculous O shape, and he could not close it at all. At the same time, there was a chain reaction in the square outside the window. No one knew who was the first to look up and discover it, but then it spread rapidly like a violent poison. Large groups of people looked up and stared blankly. Their bodies, movements, and every expression on their faces froze in an instant, and they were dumbfounded like statues. In the open space of the square below, where thousands of eyes were focused, Harvey and the other members of the temple were the last to react. It was not that they had discovered anything, but that the originally restless and excited people suddenly quieted down, and the atmosphere became extremely strange. Only then did they notice the abnormality and look up subconsciously. Oh, God! It had to be said that this was professionalism. Details could best reflect professionalism. When ordinary people's minds were suddenly hit by a strong impact, they would usually subconsciously call out the closest and most trusted person in their heart to protect them, such as Mom and so on. But clerics were different. In their pyramid of relationships, their parents and elders were definitely ranked below God. Therefore, when their minds were hit by a strong impact, they would subconsciously blurt out, God. However, this time, it was not a meaningless exclamation, but an objective fact. As the saying went, there was a God 3 feet above one's head. Now, directly above Harvey and the others, about 300 feet in the air, there was such a majestic statue floating. A handsome face, half-exposed clothes, a muscular body, and a torch in his hand. Everything was alive. Every feature matched the statue of the God of Light that was erected on the roofs of churches all over Bran. In front of this seemingly huge statue, the tall statue of the judge standing in the center of the square below suddenly seemed extremely small and incomparable. A miracle! A real miracle! It had to be said that this scene was really frightening, and more importantly, it appeared at a special time. Silence, dead silence. Thousands of people below looked at the huge statue with their mouths open, and their minds were blank. They did not know if this sudden miracle was to punish Sylvia personally or to redress the injustice for Sylvia. However, no matter what the situation was, it was absolutely shocking to the people present. In front of the real miracle that they had witnessed with their own eyes, the crowd involuntarily copied the scene that had happened in the north. Their legs went soft, and they fell to their knees. No one knew who took the lead for the first time, but in a short moment, it was as if an irresistible gust of wind had blown into the square, and the thousands of people were like wheat stalks in the field, bending down and prostrating themselves on the ground. The scene was magnificent for a moment, and in the center of the square, Sylvia, who seemed to be receiving the worship of tens of thousands of people, looked up at the statue in the sky. The first thought that flashed through her mind was not a god, but a certain wretched figure. She was all too familiar with this scene, because not long ago, someone had played this trick right under her nose. Is he here? Why did you save me? At this moment, Sylvia, whose heart was as calm as still water even when she walked onto the judgment platform, felt her eyes suddenly become extremely sore. Her thoughts were instantly filled with a myriad of waves, complicated to the extreme. Even she herself didn't know what she was thinking at this moment, or what she should be thinking. Happy. I'm a member of the clergy. Why would I be happy that an evil heretic came to save me? Moreover, wasn't the reason why the temple had fallen to such a state because of him? So, shouldn't I hate him to the core? Yes, I hate him, that must be it. But, why do I feel like I'm being hypocritical? I was obviously looking forward to it before. Wait. And what exactly are you thinking? She clenched her fists so tightly that her nails dug into her palms without her realizing it. Blinking her eyes, She didn't dare to lower her head because this was the only way to forcibly suppress something. At this moment, Sylvia's heart was in a complete mess. At this moment, some people had already recovered from their shock. As mentioned earlier, the south of Bran was very isolated from the north, and the flow of information was not smooth. Therefore, the people here basically didn't know that the so-called miracle in front of them had already been done by someone in the north. Of course, even if someone like Harvey knew, due to his identity, he was still bewildered and didn't dare to say too much. After all, no one knew whether this miracle was real or fake. If they really offended the majesty of the gods, they would be in big trouble. However, among them, there were some people who didn't care about the so-called gods at all. Stop pretending to be mysterious. Break. With a loud roar, a greenish-purple spear energy shot out rapidly from the oriental shop. With a flash of thunder, it instantly pierced through the statue in the air. Needless to say, this was Wenslin's attack. When he saw the statue for the first time, he was also shocked. However, as a member of the Sword God's bloodline, he didn't have a good impression of the Temple of Light, and he didn't have much respect for this big boss of the temple. Therefore, when he realized what was going on, he immediately attacked. However, this move was undoubtedly a bolt from the blue for the people present, and they couldn't accept it. Seeing the spear energy pierce through the left chest of the statue and instantly pierce through it, the thousands of people couldn't help but scream, and their hearts skipped a beat. The timid ones even covered their eyes subconsciously and collapsed to the ground while trembling. It was over. Wasn't it the end of the world if they angered the gods? Who could survive? However, in the next moment, the world wasn't destroyed and everyone was still fine. After the greenish-purple spear energy pierced through the heart of the statue, it flew up into the sky. However, the huge statue wasn't damaged at all and was still hovering in the air. Instantly, there were thunderous cheers. The thousands of people patted their chests with excitement on their faces, thinking that the gods were indeed gods. How could they be sneak-attacked by mortals? However, Harvey, who was standing by the window with his spear raised, frowned. Of course, he wasn't one of those ignorant people. Just one spear attack made him very suspicious. Was it a shadow? At this moment, suddenly, with a series of bangs, the square changed again. Dozens of small crystal bottles were thrown out from every corner of the crowd. Most of them were thrown into the open space around the judgment platform, and a few exploded in the square. Instantly, waves of suffocating black smoke rose into the air, and a large area of dazzling white light radiated into the surroundings, covering everyone in the square. Especially the open space in the center, it was completely covered. Damn it! After a momentary pause, Wenslin, who was looking down from high above, instantly understood. Whatever statue or miracle, it was just a cover. What the other party wanted was to make the thousands of people in the square kneel on the ground. Because only in this way would they not be hurt by the flashing crystals, smoke bottles, and other alchemy tools that were thrown out. Therefore, the only ones who were really affected were. Wenslin suddenly turned his head and squinted his eyes fiercely at the center of the square. Good trick. Good scheme. As expected, the people of the temple who were shocked and doubtful didn't choose to kneel in front of the statue that they didn't know was real or fake. This was equivalent to taking the damage effect of all the alchemy tools. Although they couldn't see their current situation for the time being because of the thick fog and the dazzling white light, listening to the continuous waves of miserable howls coming from there, they knew what kind of embarrassing scene it was inside. At this moment, dozens of figures suddenly jumped out from the kneeling crowd and instantly got into the thick fog and white light, running toward the judgment platform where Sylvia was. Needless to say, they were naturally here to save her. However, it was also because of seeing these dozens of figures that Wenslin, who was about to jump out of the window, suddenly looked stunned. He paused, frowned and shook his head. No. It's not him. These people were indeed not the Tang En that Wenslin imagined, because the dazzling white light that burst out of them was the holy combat power that was unique to the temple. Owens. Sylvia, who was sitting on the platform, was also considered to be in a high position, so she recognized these figures that rushed toward her at the first moment. They were Owens and the other Puritans who had been trying to organize a rescue during the escort. Suddenly, Owens had also seen the fake miracle with her, so it was not surprising that he knew the method. And to say that, the corner of her mouth was slightly pursed, and Sylvia smiled sadly, not knowing whether it was disappointment, regret, or self-mockery. She lowered her head and murmured in a low voice, "So, it's not you. What a pity!" Chapter 941. He howled, "Ah! Kill! 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 Kill this group of, this group of fallen heretics! Damn it, The strong light was dazzling, and the smoke was choking their noses. In an instant, Harvey, who was covered in tears and snot, jumped in a panic, screaming and roaring. Harvey was not surprised by the sudden appearance of Owens and the others. After all, they had tried to rescue him several times along the way, and they were familiar with each other. But he did not expect that the other party would be so insidious this time. First, they used the false miracle as a shield, and then these alchemy tools that were not fatal but annoying enough to attack. In an instant, the situation was thrown into chaos. However, they were prepared. Just as Owens and the others rushed to the judgment platform, 4 figures quickly stood at the 4 corners of the platform. First, they held up their shields at the same time, and then waved their magic wands. Light flowed, and in an instant, a thick light wall was set up around the platform, blocking the attacker's attempt to rescue him. Immediately, the surrounding knights rushed forward to surround him. But at this moment, break! Amidst the entanglement, a figure suddenly leaped into the air with a roar. Together with his spear, he instantly passed over the head of the knight. He stretched out his hand, and the spear that contained the explosive divine battle aura collided directly with the thick light wall. Boom! The air waves rolled, and the wind was overflowing. Under the violent impact, the bright light was extremely dazzling in the thick ink-like black fog. The bluestone floor around the platform jumped out of thin air and exploded at the same time. Dust filled the air and the wind and clouds changed. Immediately, the light wall on the north side of the platform broke. Puff! The mage standing at the north corner suddenly spat out a large mouthful of blood. His body was like a leaf in the wind, and in an instant, he fell into the black fog and disappeared without a trace. After all, it was a magic light wall that was set up in a hurry. Naturally, it could not withstand such a violent blow. However, these mages did not intend to stop the attacker. They just wanted to stop him. Then, Owens. Similarly, a spear of light shot out from the side and immediately stopped the attacker, who broke the light wall and jumped onto the platform. He shouted in a low voice, "Do you really want to betray the temple?" With a bang, the 2 spears collided in the air and flew back. The attacker who landed back on the ground shook a little, then took a few steps back to stabilize himself. Who else could it be but the other holy head knight of the temple, Owens? To be able to exchange a spear with him in a draw, his opponent must also be a holy head commander. Owens carelessly wiped the blood from the corner of his mouth, waved his long spear, smiled and said, "Why don't you say that the divine palace betrayed us?" Ridiculous! Within the black fog, the blurry figure a few steps away reprimanded without even thinking. "It seems that you have truly fallen completely. That's why I said we didn't have any chemistry." Owens was not surprised by the other party's reaction. He took a step forward and casually brandished his spear. "Since that's the case, let's use it to talk." As soon as he finished speaking, he no longer spoke and brandished his spear to attack. Owens looked so casual and calm on the surface, as if he didn't care about the other party at all. But in fact, at this time, he was very anxious and did not dare to waste any time. Along the way, except for destroying the long-distance teleportation circle, they were lucky enough to escape from the temple's pursuit. There was no other way. The two sides were too familiar with each other. There was almost no room for trick. In a head-on battle, the manpower that had been specially transferred from the temple's headquarters was not something that Owens and the others could resist. A few days ago, when he first arrived in the south, he saw that the temple's team suddenly divided into two groups. One group was escorting Sylvia to the trial, and the other group was escorting the other Puritans to the headquarters. When Owens saw this, he sensed that the opportunity had come. After all, Sylvia was only one person. The strength of the guards was naturally not as strong as the other team. This was the best time to rescue her. But from the current situation, Owens could not help but secretly complain in his heart. The other party really thought highly of Sylvia. It was true that the guards were divided, but most of them, including the temple's mages and the holy head knight in front of him, chose to follow this team. Owens did not know that there was something fishy about this. In order to let Sylvia come to the trial, Wensin used many family connections, and even implicated the royal court. The temple had to give this face. How could Harvey dare to let the escort team have the slightest accident? Trouble. In the entanglement, Owens took the opportunity to roughly observe the situation in the field. The black fog was still entangled and had not dispersed. It was not very clear, but the people on his side were indeed entangled. Although the impact of the surprise attack was still there, it was unlikely to save Sylvia in one fell swoop. But even so, no one proposed to retreat. They really had no other choice now, unless they gave up on Sylvia and watched her burn to death. Otherwise, before the trial, they would absolutely not retreat. What to do, burning with anxiety, Owens, who was distracted by other things, immediately suffered retribution. For a moment, the opponent's spear closed in on him, and the layers of spear shadows were instantly nullified. They were both holy head knight, and the opponent's strength was not low. Seeing a flaw in Owens's delicate and fast spear shadows, it was naturally impossible for him to not grasp it. The light burst out decisively, and in an instant, Owens was shaken off the platform. If it were not for the fact that the black fog was really annoying and it was not suitable to pursue the victory, Owens was afraid that he would be completely passive. But because of this, Owens looked at the surrounding black fog, and his heart suddenly moved. A figure appeared in his mind. It must be known that he was just using this as a pretext to make a fuss. This false miracle, flash crystal, smoke bottle, and other wretched means were not used by him. It was complicated to say, but in fact, from the beginning of Owens and the other's surprise attack to the failure of the first attack on the platform, it was only a short moment. At this time, the thousands of people in the square reacted. In an instant, the people near the platform saw the raging light and the overflowing wind in front of them, and they immediately retreated in fear. However, even if they wanted to retreat, some people behind them were unwilling to move. As the saying goes, a trial with a show of robbing the execution ground is a complete trial. It was not easy to wait for this good show to turn around, so naturally, they did not want to leave so early. Of course, more importantly, their position was at the back, so they were not very worried about their safety. The front wanted to retreat, and the back wanted to stay. The scene immediately fell into chaos again. At this time, "Idiot, what are you waiting for? Start the execution." Looking at the stalemate situation in the square, Harvey, who had barely recovered his vision, could not help but feel relieved. Then, the anger in his chest continued to rise. He turned his head and roared at the knight who was holding a torch not far away, who seemed to be stunned. "Sir!" The head knight who was fighting with Owens frowned and could not help but remind him, "Sir." As soon as the words came out of his mouth, Harvey also knew that he was stupid. This kind of order should have been given secretly. Wasn't it forcing Owens and the others to fight with their lives on the line? Yes. The knight who was looking around didn't think much of it. He was startled at first, then quickly nodded and rushed down the platform with the torch. "Stop him! Stop them!" The orders with similar content sounded almost at the same time. The first one came from Owens and the others. Dry wood and branches were combustible. Once ignited, this wooden platform and Sylvia would instantly become a sea of fire, and there was no saving them. As for the second one, it was of course from Harvey. The situation had developed to this point, and he did not expect to be able to persuade Sylvia or continue to watch her make a fool of herself. He just wanted to burn her as soon as possible to end the chaos here. After all, the ordinary people did not know about the internal turmoil in the temple, and the temple could not expose its own scandal. Therefore, the ordinary people only knew that Sylvia's fall, but they did not know that it involved Owens and several other Puritans, and the result was also obvious. Harvey's order was much more effective than Owens and the others. Although Owens and the others were already attacking crazily, the number of casualties increased sharply in an instant. But after all, the difference in manpower was obvious. Coupled with the fact that there was a master on Harvey's side, they could not break through the defense at all. They could only watch the bright torches in the black fog as they approached the bottom of the platform. "Stop! Ugh!" With a muffled groan, Owens paid the price of a bloody hole in his left shoulder to temporarily turn the passive situation around. He roared at the knight in the distance, "That's Sylvia! That's the King Xia Wei, and that you worship, admire, and even secretly admire. You want to burn her to death? Are you sure you want to burn her to death?" Although his words were intermittent, Owens's meaning was undoubtedly extremely obvious. He was using Sylvia's excellent character and popularity in the temple to play the closeness card. For this reason, he even used the name of adoration. Of course, this couldn't be considered as speaking without thinking. Xia Weian did indeed have many supporters in the shrine, and this was obvious from the fact that Archbishop Simon's child didn't hesitate to clear her name of treason. However, the blurry figure of the knight in the black fog turned around and looked over. He waved the torch as if he was enraged. He said firmly, "I'm sure. I want to burn her to death with my own hands. Who asked her to reject me before? Cough cough about that, sir, I'm just following orders." Halfway through his words, the knight seemed to feel that it was inappropriate and quickly changed his words. But this was enough to make everyone present collapse. What was going on? Love and hate? If you can't get her, you're going to destroy her. Owens was also dumbfounded when he heard this. When he reacted, he wanted to slap himself. Damn it, his mouth was too cheap. Not to mention the crowd, even Sylvia, who was in a daze on the platform, could not help but look at the knight. It was not that she was suspicious. She had indeed rejected the pursuit of many admirers in the temple. She was just thinking about whether she had said any harsh words when she had rejected them. Otherwise, why would the knight hate her so much? Harvey was amused when he heard this. "Haha. Well said. I promise that as long as you follow orders, no one will blame you." "Yes, sir." Having received support, the knight no longer hesitated and bent over to ignite the dry wood and branches. "How dare you, ah!" In an instant, more than 10 furious roars were heard one after another. But the knight seemed to have made up his mind. He lowered his head and focused on igniting the fire, completely ignoring them. "What are you doing?" Harvey looked at the knight's actions in bewilderment. The knight did not throw out the torch to ignite it all at once. Instead, he held the torch and walked around the platform hurriedly while igniting the dry wood and branches in the peripheral area. He was very careful in his actions and basically left as soon as the fire was ignited. "Sir, it's too easy to burn her to death at once. It's too easy. I was thinking that if I ignited all the firewood in the periphery, it would not delay things and we could watch it slowly burn to the inside. The effect should be better." How much hatred was there? Harvey and the three mages standing around the platform couldn't help but look at each other when they heard this. Their expressions were very strange. But then they thought of the sincere words that the knight had unintentionally revealed just now and suddenly understood. He was taking the opportunity to retaliate. Nonsense. Harvey pretended to be angry and reprimanded. Then he looked at Sylvia on the platform with a faint smile. "Haha, it seems that Sir's popularity is not very good." Sylvia did not care about this ridicule. Instead, she looked seriously at the knight who was igniting the fire around her. She watched until the knight finished igniting all the firewood and threw away the torch. Then she pursed her lips and bowed solemnly. "I'm sorry." "Yeah? I'm sorry. Although I don't remember you, and I also forgot the words of rejection I said at that time. But I think that those words must have been very hurtful. I sincerely apologize here and hope that you can forgive me." He scratched his head. Also. Sylvia straightened her body and took a small breath. "If possible, I would like to know what I said at that time." "Actually, it's nothing. Well, you looked down on me at that time." Under the illumination of the fire, the young knight bent his arm and looked agitated. "You said that you only like people who are stronger than you. You also ridiculed me for not having enough strength and wanted to arm wrestle with me to reject me. Damn, I'm so angry when I talk about this." He waved his fist angrily and roared with righteous indignation. "We haven't even competed yet. How do you know that my strength is not as good as yours? Besides, even if my strength is not as good as yours, do you know how hurtful your words are? Men. You can say anything, but you can't say no." Chapter 942. As a man, you can say anything, but you can't say no. The young knight clenched his fist and punched out. His powerful posture and words, coupled with his agitated accusation, immediately made the judgment stand fall into a dead silence. Sylvia blinked and blinked again, looking a little confused. Harvey and the others were dumbfounded. They looked at the unusually agitated young knight with an extremely strange expression. "No way. Just because of this reason, he hates me until now?" If Harvey and the others didn't know whether to laugh or cry at these words, then the young knight's next move made them completely dumbfounded. Across the gradually rising wall of fire, the young knight calmed down a little, lowered his head, and spread his hands sadly. "Of course, I know this reason is extremely ridiculous in your eyes. After all, I have the right to like you, and of course, you have the right to reject me. I shouldn't hate you so much. But you don't have to hate me. We can't be together in life, but we must sleep together in death. Sorry, this is the only way I can think of that you can't reject me." After he finished speaking, the young knight first bowed and apologized under Xiao Weian's strange gaze. Then, he suddenly rushed forward, instantly passing through the wall of fire and stepping onto the platform. Then, the fire rose high, completely blocking the view of the outside world. Harvey and the other three mages subconsciously opened their mouths and stretched out their hands. Witnessing this amazing turn of events with their own eyes, even Harvey and the other three mages were stunned. They turned their heads and looked at each other, not knowing what expression to put on for a moment. "Oh, it's burning, it's really burning." Sigh, a beautiful woman with a unique temperament. Did I see it wrong? Why did someone rush in just now? Although the open space in the square was heavily affected by the black fog, because of the wall of fire, it was now very eye-catching. Philip, who was condescending, leaned half of his body out of the window. Suddenly, he saw something and turned his head blankly. Could it be the legendary, suicide for love? It had to be said that mental patients had a broad mind. Philip, who had always been a weirdo, had quite accurate intuition. Without being at the scene, he actually guessed the thoughts of Harvey and the others at the moment. And at this moment, Winston, who had his arms crossed in boredom because Twain did not appear and was watching coldly from the sidelines, suddenly had a serious expression. He quickly stepped to the side of the window, His eyes narrowed, and stared fixedly at the dazzling fire in the black fog. In the next moment, whoosh! Blazing flames suddenly shot up into the sky and spun into a gust of wind, instantly cleansing the dense black mist in the surroundings. Subsequently, the might of the flames expanded, revolved, continued expanding, and revolved swiftly. In merely a short period of a few breaths of time, when looked at from afar, a flaming tempest had suddenly taken form madly, and it stirred up the surroundings and raged without restraint. Philip opened his mouth and was stunned. On the other hand, Alan seemed to have thought of something. His lowered hands unconsciously clenched into fists, and a hint of excitement flashed in his eyes. This was a storm. Sir is here. In just a moment of thought, a strange muffled bang sounded. The flaming tempest that was constantly expanding and rotating right under their eyes seemed to have reached a critical point and decisively exploded. It was like fireworks and also like the falling of the Milky Way. With a loud bang, flaming meteors instantly broke through the sky and radiated in a dreamy and magnificent manner. They not only covered the surroundings of the square, but also completely filled the field of vision from above. Even though they were far away, Philip and the others could feel a warm wind blowing against their faces. They subconsciously licked their lips and murmured in a low voice as if they were dreaming, "So King beautiful." Philip thought it was beautiful, but in the eyes of Harvey and the others, it was an out-and-out disaster, especially the three mages who were closest to the platform. No one knew what had happened. A moment ago, they were still lamenting the irrational behavior of the young knight, and the next moment there was a blur in front of their eyes, and waves of scorching heat hit them head-on. Before they could react, they saw the monstrous flames that blotted out the sky and covered the sun, like an ancient giant beast with its bloody mouth wide open. In just a moment they were completely swallowed up. "Ah!" Harvey screamed. Harvey, who was far away, was lucky enough not to be engulfed by the fire at the first moment, but he couldn't hide from the dense fire meteors behind him. The huge gas that had just been compressed and exploded was sent into the air, but it was hit by the fire dragons one after another. As it twitched and screamed, it went up and down, left and right, like a rootless duckweed or a willow catkin in the wind. It was completely out of its control. When the unclothed Harvey finally fell to the ground, more than half of his old bones were scattered. What the hell happened? Harvey looked around in a daze. The trial platform had been completely destroyed, and Sylvia and the young knight had disappeared. He didn't know whether they were dead or not. The ground around him was covered with blackened branches and dry firewood. These were the flaming meteors that constantly swept across the sky, and also the culprit that caused him to be in such a sorry state in the air. When he turned his head again, a piece of charred wood with black smoke was lying not far in front of him, vaguely in the shape of a human. He sniffed with his nose and could even smell some burnt meat. Meat? Harvey was stunned, and his old eyes suddenly widened. He screamed and jumped up like a rabbit that had been shot by an arrow, rolling and crawling as he kept retreating. What kind of human-shaped charred wood was that? It was clearly a corpse that had been roasted from the inside out. Looking at the charred wood staff that was tightly gripped in the corpse's hand, it wasn't difficult to tell that it was one of the three temple mages, but he didn't know which one. At this moment, an anxious roar suddenly came from afar. "Sir, be careful." Be careful? Be careful of what? Although he was quite frightened, Harvey, who was dizzy from the fall, was obviously not completely awake. He looked around blankly and found that he had been sent to the edge of the open space. The people who were originally here had retreated more than 10 feet. So now there were no enemies around, and no one was on his side. He was temporarily out of the battle circle. The one who warned him was the head commander in the distance. He looked very anxious and wanted to rush over many times, but he was helplessly entangled by Owens and couldn't get away. This familiar scene was exactly the same as when Owens wanted to get away to save Sylvia, but he was entangled by the head commander. However, Owens was obviously a little worse. Not only did he not let the head commander get away, but he also kept shouting as if he was deliberately suppressing the head commander's warning. It's okay, it's okay. You heard wrong. We are not calling you sir. Sir, have you had lunch? If you haven't, are you hungry? Have you eaten? Then what did you eat? Bread or cheese? What about you? You speak too slowly. Isn't it good that I helped you ask? Sir, be careful above. Hide quickly. Just when Owens was pestering endlessly and Harvey was even more confused, a light knight not far away finally realized that something was wrong and shouted anxiously. Above? Harvey looked up subconsciously. The first thing he saw was the fake statue floating in the air, and then a huge hammer suddenly appeared in his line of sight. From the angle directly below, it looked like the god of light was holding a hammer and mercilessly smashing it at his head in an instant. His pupils contracted sharply. At this time, Harvey realized where the danger came from. The statue of the judge, which was originally standing behind the judgment platform, had collapsed, perhaps because of the explosion of the storm just now, and the direction was coincidentally in his direction. Harvey was not a strong warrior. He was a mage, and his weak body would not reflexively dodge in the face of danger. And because he was focused on his official career, his magic cultivation was just passable. Now, looking at the huge hammer that was getting closer and closer, his thoughts were running fast, but his hands and feet were cold. Not to mention dodging, he couldn't even take a simple step. This is retribution. Is this the punishment given to me by Father? Looking at the hammer in the God of Light's hand, Harvey's mind flashed this last thought. Then, sir. Boom. Gravel splashed, dust filled the sky, and the ground of the square trembled at this moment, as if it was about to collapse. Then, screams of horror came from all directions, one after another. At this time, the thousands of people realized that it was not a good time to watch a show, but a deadly battle between masters. If they were not careful, they might be involved in it and become cannon fodder. Suddenly, the sea of people in the square seemed to have become a pot of boiling water, and the curtain of chaos opened. It's him, right? On the third floor of the shop, Philip looked from beginning to end, shook his head, and smacked his lips. Tsk, I was a little puzzled before. These people who came to rescue were too bold, using their own father as a cover. So that's how it is. If it's that wretched guy, then everything is not strange. He did not say it clearly, but in fact, it was not much different from saying it clearly. It was easy to think of a person who had such shocking destructive power as soon as he appeared. There was a loud laugh. Ha ha! Finally willing to come out. Stepping on the window lattice and leaping into the air of the square, Winston was not in a hurry to find Tang En's trace. Instead, he suddenly looked up to the sky and roared, the sound echoing for several miles. The next moment, from all directions outside the square, there were several long roars at the same time, and the sound was like thunder. Obviously, this should be the master that Harvey prepared for Tang En. Chapter 943. First, it was the majestic statue, followed by alchemy props such as flashing crystals and smoke bottles to create chaos. Then, it was the scene of robbing the execution ground, followed by the explosion of the flame storm and the collapse of the statue in a short period of time. A series of actions were performed one after another. The sound and light effects were excellent, dazzling thousands of people who were watching. If their lives were not in danger, this trip would definitely not be in vain. Unfortunately, when the gods fought, the mortals always suffered. By the time the people reacted, there were already people surging in front of them. They were screaming, and the scene was completely chaotic. In such a chaotic situation, it was naturally not suitable for them to watch the show. As they hurriedly squeezed and fled, they temporarily forgot when Sylvia, who was at the center of the incident, disappeared, and whether she was buried in the sea of fire, at this time, on the west side of the square. On the extremely deserted street, because everyone ran to watch the show, a young temple knight carried a woman on his back and ran wildly. Huff! What did I tell you before? I told you to keep a low profile. That group of scammers is unreliable, but you didn't believe me. Huff! What now? You've been betrayed, right? You deserve it. Huff! But how was my confession just now? Isn't it great? Are you touched? You're just using this to divert everyone's attention so that the fire in the periphery will burn. After that, you'll take the opportunity to use that firestorm-like martial skill to escape. After a calm analysis, his expression became slightly hesitant, and he asked another question. Am I right? Damn. You're destined to be alone for the rest of your life. This is not the point, okay? Ahem, the point is acting. Acting, understand? Those idiots must have thought that I committed suicide for love. Haha. Ah, stop it. You're not the one running. Why are you panting? It's very itchy, you know. His breathing became heavier. Tang-en. Yes? Has anyone ever told you that you're really shameless? No. He simply denied it. The young temple knight who was panting suddenly turned his head and grinned, revealing 2 rows of white teeth. Look, my teeth are dripping. Why are you panting again? He was speechless. By the way, Sylvia. He gritted his teeth. Yes. Has anyone ever told you that you should really lose weight? Don't pinch, don't pinch. You're allowed to complain, but I'm not allowed to retaliate? Besides, you're really heavy right now. I feel like I'm carrying a huge mountain. Damn. Still pinching? If you pinch me again, I'll throw you away. Pa. It feels pretty good. Everything is stable now. Needless to say, the 2 who ran away in a sorry state were naturally Tang-en and Sylvia. In fact, according to Tang-en's previous plan, they were supposed to rescue Alan and the others in the next 2 days. However, after knowing that Winston had brought together Alan and Josiah's family members with Sylvia, the choice that Tang-en had previously faced naturally no longer existed. After hearing about Philip's existence, Tang-en was even more assured about the former's safety, so he changed his plan. In any case, saving one person was the same as saving 2 people. After knowing that Sylvia's trial was a good starting point, Tang-en decided to save her first. After all, Winston's target was him, so regardless of whether he stepped into this trap or not, the other party would come looking for trouble. So before that, he might as well do something that he liked to do. Huff, huff. Take a break first. After running out of the street, Tang-en turned into an alley and put Sylvia down. Then, he leaned against the opposite wall, panting heavily like a dead dog, sweat dripping down like water. Sylvia did not make a sound, but she did not look friendly at all. Her expression was cold, and her eyes were as sharp as a knife. She looked straight at Tang-en, as if she wanted to poke a few holes in his body. In fact, if it was convenient for her, Sylvia would not have just pinched Tang-en, but would have directly fought him. This guy, he actually patted her there, however. After seeing Tang-en's sweaty face and heaving chest, Sylvia pursed her lips and took the initiative to lower her eyes. Tang-en's words just now were not entirely a joke. Sylvia was really heavy now. It was not her weight, but the restriction on her body was as heavy as a mountain. Think about it, even with Sylvia's innate strength, she was almost unable to walk under the pressure of this unknown restriction. One could imagine the pressure on Tang-en, who had carried her until now. Fortunately, Tang-en had strengthened his strength training during this period of time. Otherwise, it would be a real tragedy if he could save someone but could not move her away. Feeling that the aura on the other side had weakened slightly, Tang-en touched his nose and smiled awkwardly. Well, just now, there are 2 restrictions on my body. As if she did not want to talk about what had happened just now, Sylvia took the initiative to change the topic. One is inside my body, sealing my fighting energy. The other is outside my body, infinitely increasing my burden. After a pause, she looked at Tang En and pursed her lips and said, "This second restriction is actually not very significant. I originally thought that someone wanted to deliberately embarrass me. Now that I think about it, this should be directed at you. You can't run far with me on your back." This was indeed Wensillen's plan. Tang En's speed was too abnormal. If there was no restriction, forget about encircling and suppressing him, it would be a problem to even see Tang En's back. "What kind of look is that? It's as if you were implicated by me. Please, I just saved you from the sea of fire." Seeing that the other party no longer pursued the matter, Tang En said smoothly. Sylvia ignored Tang En's intention to deliberately misinterpret and asked directly, "You know this is a trap, why did you still come to save me? Since we're acquaintances, since we met, I can't just leave you in the lurch." Tang En spread his hands. "Is that so?" With her back against the wall, Sylvia took a deep look at Tang En and said noncommittally, "What else?" All right, my brain suddenly short-circuited, all right?" Meeting Sylvia's seemingly meaningful eyes, for some reason, Tang En suddenly felt a little uncomfortable. He waved his hand and changed the topic. "By the way, can this restriction be lifted? If I carry you on my back again, before anyone catches up, I'll probably be half dead from exhaustion." "Yes, just find a high priest." Tang En rolled his eyes speechlessly. "Isn't this nonsense? Do you still have a good relationship with people in the temple?" "Actually," Sylvia hesitated and said, "give me a little more time. After my realm improves, I may be able to lift it on my own." Tang En was stunned when he heard this, and then he thought of the scene where Sylvia walked towards the judgment platform with an irresistible majestic momentum. He raised his eyebrows in surprise. "What, do you have an epiphany?" Sylvia nodded. Tang En couldn't help but shake his head and laugh when he saw this. He sighed with emotion. This matter is really. When we left the square just now, the old man named Harvey seemed to have been smashed to death. Now it seems that it's fortunate that he died early, otherwise, wouldn't he be angered to death by you?" Sylvia's martial arts talent was extremely outstanding. What was even rarer was that she had experienced hundreds of battles and walked on the edge of life and death all year round. In this way, as long as she didn't die, it was only a matter of time before her realm improved. It was not surprising. What was a little unexpected was that the key step from the peak of Earth level to Void level was actually because of this trial. If Harvey didn't die, he might really vomit blood and die of suffocation. "Well, it seems that I have to save you." After a little rest, Tang En got up and came to Sylvia. He turned his back. "Come on up, Sir Knight who benefited from a disaster." As soon as the teasing words fell, suddenly, "It's you? Here. Someone come quickly, that bitch escaped." Tang En and Sylvia turned their heads in shock and saw at the end of the alley, a fat auntie with an empty basket on her arm was pointing in their direction. She looked excited and kept shouting. This place was not far from the square. After the chaos broke out, the people who stood on the periphery of the crowd, such as this auntie, would have been here if they had retreated in time. There are bad people in the crowd. Shaking his head, Tang En no longer hesitated. He carried Sylvia on his back and ran out of the alley. However, perhaps because the auntie's voice was too sharp, Tang En and Sylvia had just left the alley. "Stop!" At the end of the left side of the street, a middle-aged man with a heavy sword had just turned around and immediately saw Tang En and Sylvia. He immediately shouted in joy. "Do you think I'm an idiot?" Curling his lips in disdain, Tang En decisively ran to the right. Xia Weian turned her head and looked at the middle-aged man who was shouting a warning as he chased after her. She frowned. "It's only an Earth stage warrior. With your strength, it won't take you long." "No need, these are just cannon fodder." Glancing around, Tang En casually explained, "That guy Wensillen has put in a lot of effort this time. I don't know where he found them, but there are 4 genuine Void Stage powerhouses. Damn, didn't they say that Void Stage powerhouses are rare? Why are they like leaks now? Cut a bunch and a bunch comes out. One Sillen. What, you don't know him? The last disciple of the sword god. I broke one of his claws not long ago. After explaining the grudge between the two sides concisely, Tang En licked his lips. Unfortunately, it seems that he doesn't learn from his mistakes. Does he really think that I don't dare to kill him? I've never dealt with him, but I've heard of him. Pause for a while. Sylvia shook her head speechlessly and sighed. I only knew that your strength increased at an astonishing speed, but I didn't expect that your ability to cause trouble was also so good. First, he helped the Grey Coat army fight against the Bran Empire, then provoked the Temple of Light, and now he fought against the Sword God's disciple. Other than the barbarians of the northern wilderness, Sylvia really couldn't think of anyone else who could do such a crazy thing as Tang En to provoke the three giants in one breath, and still be alive and kicking. It's really not my fault. I can only say that those who are not envied are mediocre. Tang En could roughly guess the reason why Wen Sillen would do this. It was nothing more than being too arrogant and living too comfortably. Now that he had suddenly suffered a blow, the difference was too great. His thoughts were suddenly confused, and he wanted to get back at him. However, from the corner of his eye, Tang En narrowed his long and narrow eyes, and the corners of his mouth curled up into a sneer. Since your wish is so strong, then I'll fulfill your wish and leave you with a memorable lesson. Don't thank me. Chapter 944. At noon, the chaos in the square was still ongoing. There were too many people who came to watch the show. In the chaos, they ran and trampled. It was seriously congested. It would not stop for a few hours. And a good trial play had turned into such a terrible disaster. It was really unexpected. However, this ending was acceptable to Tang En and Wenslin, who were hiding behind the incident. Tang En's purpose was to save people, and Wenslin's purpose was to force Tang En out. Now that Tang En had succeeded in saving people, and Wenslin had succeeded in forcing Tang En to show up, both sides were happy and had achieved their goals. As for what happened after that, of course, it would depend on their own abilities. However, the first to make a move was not Tang En and Wenslin, but the subordinates of both sides. In the Eastern clothing store in the square, Wenslin had just jumped out of the window when his subordinates came over politely and asked Philip, Alan, and the others to leave with them. Of course, it was not coercion. With Philip's status, there were not many people in the Bran Empire who dared to coerce him. On the contrary, there were many people who were worried about his safety. In fact, Wenslin's subordinates did think so. The situation was too chaotic now, and the internal battle in the temple in the center of the square was very fierce. It would not stop for a while. It was better to take this master and leave as soon as possible to avoid any more mishaps. It would be difficult to explain. Philip and Alan were very cooperative. Since they already knew that Tang En had saved Sylvia and left, there was not much to see here. It did not matter whether they left early or late. But when Philip turned to leave the window, he looked at the guard commander with sympathy. There's no problem to leave now, but be careful. Don't worry, sir. We will definitely protect you, the guard commander replied in a neither servile nor overbearing manner. Ha, I'm not talking about us. Waving his hand, Philip threw down this somewhat inexplicable sentence. He put his arm around the shoulder of the rich merchant's daughter and walked toward the stairs. Alan's eyebrows moved slightly when he heard this. He also glanced at the guard commander who was in a daze and followed beside Philip. The clothing store had a total of 3 floors. Today, Winston had used his connections to occupy the 3rd floor and turned it into an observation deck. As for the 1st and 2nd floors, they were still operating normally and were not disturbed. Of course, most of the customers had gone to watch the show, so there wasn't much business now. The group of people walked down the stairs from the 3rd floor and came to the 1st floor where women's clothing was. The rich merchant's daughter looked at the dazzling array of clothing and immediately became spirited. She dragged Philip to choose a few clothes. Philip, on the other hand, did not mind at all. He, who had wandered around the brothels all year round, had long known how attractive shopping, especially clothing shops, was to women. However, the guard commander was at a loss. He was about to go over and dissuade them. Suddenly, whoosh 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 whoosh, the sound of arrows piercing through the air could be heard, and the crossbows flew everywhere. As if struck by lightning, the front row of guards who had walked out of the door instantly leaned back and fell back into the shop. Blood spurted out from the various vital points that were pierced through, instantly dyeing a large area of the ground, and the various exquisite clothes that were hung around the shop red. The shop fell silent. The shop attendants, who were guessing the situation of the trial in the square next door and complaining that their bosses were heartless, never thought that they would witness such a bloody scene in their own shop instead of seeing a cruel trial. Ah, assassins! Be alert, keep an eye on them. Damn it! The guard commander reacted immediately and roared. He waved his hand and pointed at Philip and the other two, indicating for his subordinates to keep an eye on them. However, as soon as he spoke, he was directly drowned out by the terrified screams of the surrounding shop attendants. He could not help but turn his head in anger. Shut up, find a place to hide. Before he finished speaking, he saw a screaming figure running around like a headless fly crashing into him. The vigilance of the profession of a guard was self-evident. Although he could tell that the other party was an ordinary shop attendant by his appearance, the guard commander still subconsciously reached out to push him away. However, as soon as his fingers touched the other party's clothes, his body suddenly stiffened. He looked down in shock. A pitch-black dagger easily pierced through the armor and deeply stabbed into his heart on the left side of his chest. With another twist, the accumulated strength in his body was immediately drained clean along with the wildly surging blood. Subconsciously raising his hand to grab the dagger, the guard commander's eyes widened like copper bells. He looked blankly at the cold silver mask in front of him. He opened his mouth to shout something, but his vision suddenly turned black and he fell on his back. Not only the guard commander, but the vigilant guards around him also suffered the same fate. Whether it was the few customers or the shop attendants, they were screaming non-stop in fear just a moment ago. The next moment, they suddenly turned into cold-blooded assassins, handing out death daggers and accurately stabbing into their vital points. This was not a battle, but a one-sided massacre. As for the side of the guards who were crushed, they were completely unaware of what had happened. They could only look blankly at their companions around them, falling one after another without any strength to fight back. They were instantly stunned. In fact, the guards who could follow Winston, the young master of a big family, were naturally not ordinary people. Although their strength might not be comparable to martial arts masters, in the professional field of bodyguards, what they could do, martial arts masters might not necessarily be able to do. But now, right under their noses, the service staff on this floor of the shop had been completely replaced, and they had not noticed at all. This was really inconceivable. It was also because of this that when these assassins attacked violently, the guards almost did not have any consciousness to resist and instantly lost their lives here. I knew it would be like this. What did I say before? You didn't listen to my reminder. Looking at the majority of the guards who had fallen in a short moment, Philip, who was standing at the back, did not seem surprised. He shook his head and held his forehead, looking bitter and hateful. Then, he turned around and patted the shoulder of the frightened young daughter of the rich merchant, comforting her. "It's okay, dear. Don't you want to choose clothes? I think we have to speed up. There's not much time." There was indeed not much time. More than half of the guards were killed in one confrontation, and only a small number of guards were left. Naturally, they were no match for these assassins. In the end, the young waiter who had just killed the commander of the guards walked over. He first looked at Philip, then bowed to Alan and said lightly, "Sir Alan, please follow me. I will take you to a safe place." Alan was also not surprised by the bloody scene in front of him. He knew very well that as long as Tang En was here, he would definitely come to save him. There was no doubt about that. But the person in front of him. He looked up and down, and finally focused his gaze on the silver mask on the young waiter's face. He said in surprise, "You are me." He waved his hand and interrupted, "I was sent by the boss to pick you up." Of course, Alan and Michaud had seen each other before, but at that time Michaud, who was Tang En's right-hand man, had not put on a mask. Now Michaud was also an indispensable and important character by Tang En's side, but he did not want to be recognized or mentioned by anyone. Alan was slightly startled, and Philip interrupted, curling his lips in dissatisfaction. "That guy didn't say he would bring me along? Didn't he say he would give me an explanation?" Michaud glanced at him and said calmly, "The boss said he didn't need me to say anything, and you would naturally follow him." "Ha ha, at least he has the heart." "Wait, no, is he calling me a follower?" Philip instantly reacted and cursed, "Damn it! I rushed here to clean up his mess, and he still mocked me. No, I have to poach him, I have to poach him." Does he really think that my reputation as the flower wolf of the imperial capital is fake? There will be a chance next time. Michaud's tone was still indifferent. "Josiah's family members have been safely transferred by us, just before you came here." F***ck. Philip was speechless, and the rich merchant's daughter raised her finger in horror. You. Imperial flower wolf, you are that Philip? Philip blinked and knew that he had spilled the beans. He helplessly spread out his hands and said, "If I say that I was just talking nonsense, dear, would you believe me?" Slap. "Bastard." The rich merchant's daughter covered her face and ran out of the shop crying. Young people these days are really impulsive. "It's just a nickname, is there a need to?" Rubbing the red handprint on his right cheek, Philip's expression was normal. "Didn't you say we were going to a safe place? Let's go." After a pause, Michaud slightly pursed his lips and waved his hand sideways. "Please." Michaud's subordinates would clean up the mess, and he believed that it wouldn't be long before the real waiters, who were tied up in the cubicles, came out and found that the shop was back to normal, as if nothing had happened. Walking out of the door, Philip and Alan paused and subconsciously raised their head. Traces of coolness fell on their faces, making them feel quite refreshed. "Is it raining? Haha, someone is going to cry." Chapter 945. P.S. I saw it. Don't worry, the civet cat's condition is recovering. Today's word count is close to 4,000. It's quite enjoyable to write. I hope all of you will enjoy reading it as well. Rain could be seen as the tears of God. God was never a merciful fellow. If he shed tears, it would inevitably dye the entire world with the color of sorrow. However, from Philip's mouth, someone was about to cry. Of course, this person was not Tang En. From a certain point of view, Tang En and Philip, this strange pair of bad friends, could indeed be said to be telepathic despite their different standpoints. Tang En understood Philip, so after knowing that the person who found out about Alan's identity was Philip, he simply gave up on the rescue plan and no longer worried about the safety of Alan and the others. At the same time, Philip also understood Tang En very well. Even though he knew that Wen Xin had brought a large number of masters with him this time and that their backgrounds were not small, some of them even came from the Palace of Offerings. However, since he had seen Tang En appear to save Sylvia with his own eyes, Philip believed that he must be fully prepared. Therefore, the person who was about to cry could only be Wen Xin. However, the actual situation now was that although Tang En did not cry, he also wanted to cry but had no tears. The sweat dripping from his body was much more than the tears. Sylvia was really too heavy. This weight even caused Tang En to have no trace of fanciful thoughts about men in his heart. It was as if the person he was carrying was not a great beauty with a unique temperament and a delicate body. Instead, it was a huge mountain that made one feel despair just by looking at it, and he was the foolish old man who was moving the mountain. Huff! I can't, I have to lose weight, I have to lose weight. If you continue like this, when you get married, you can directly flatten your man on the wedding bed. Although he was panting and saying that he could not, Tang En's feet were running very fast. He did not even forget to ridicule her. Then put it down. Pursing her lips, Sylvia, who had just escaped with her life from the trial platform, seemed to be in a good mood. She did not feel that she was a burden at all. She hugged Tang En's neck tightly. You brought that group of people behind you running until now. Where exactly do you want to go? Oh my! I'm warning you, don't provoke me. Do you really think I don't dare to abandon you? Huff. Wait a little longer. The terrain here isn't complicated enough. I can't move freely. Huff. Needless to say, Sylvia, who had been through hundreds of battles, could certainly understand what Tang En meant. The current situation was that Tang En could only let go of Sylvia in order to fight back. However, the key was that the current terrain was not complicated enough. Tang En could not temporarily get rid of the pursuers behind him. Therefore, if he let go of Sylvia now, she might be instantly killed by the void-level powerhouse who was chasing after them. Then you still need to run a little faster with your current speed. Looking back, Sylvia said calmly, in the sky directly behind us, in 3 minutes, a void realm cultivator can catch up with us. On the street on the right, in about 5 minutes, the cannon fodder you mentioned earlier should be able to circle around to our route. Huff. That's easy for you to say. Why don't you try to speed up? While talking, Tang En's eyes had already scanned the surrounding terrain. Then his feet suddenly stopped, changed his route, and rushed to a 3-story attic on the right. He did not enter, but stopped at the west wall of the attic, temporarily disappearing from the sight of the void-level cultivator who was chasing after him. Take a break. Putting down Sylvia, Tang En said concisely, then shook his hand, narrowed his eyes, looked up, and took a deep breath, as if to regulate his breathing. In a short moment, Sylvia watched Tang En's undulating chest slowly calm down, and couldn't help but nod lightly, showing a few traces of admiration. Of course, this was not a break, or it was not just a break. It was a quick adjustment to the best state before the battle. That's right, Tang En was about to make a move. Plans could never keep up with changes. Because of the previous righteous ante, Tang En's whereabouts were exposed a little too early, and soon they were targeted by the nearby Earth-level cultivators, as well as the Void-level cultivators who rushed over. With Tang En's current speed, it was impossible to get rid of them. Only by quickly killing these two people could they have a chance to run to the complicated terrain. And this was what made Sylvia puzzled. Needless to say, Earth-level cultivators were not an issue. Sylvia believed that if Tang En really wanted to kill them, it was not impossible to kill them in one move. But the Void-level cultivators were different. Even if Tang En had a variety of strange assassination methods, even if Tang En's strength was higher than the opponent's, in the boundless sky battle, the opponent could advance and retreat freely. No matter how one looked at it, the outcome would not be decided in a short time. And as far as Sylvia knew, although Tang En had the strength of a void-level cultivator, he never liked to fly in the air. The only time he fought in the air was when she waved her spear to help him. The pursuers came quickly. Just as Sylvia was thinking, the void-level cultivator finally met Tang En for the first time. A short old man in a navy blue robe, with a goatee, looked very ordinary. It should be similar to Xia Weian's idea. This void-level old man appeared very openly, and did not seem to be in a hurry to call Wen Silin and the others over. He just floated in the air above the left side of the attic, and looked directly at Twain, who was still dressed as a light knight, with a slightly scrutinizing gaze, seemingly curious, but also somewhat disdainful. Unchilua. Narrowing her eyes, Sylvia looked at the void-level old man who completely ignored her existence and frowned as she called out the other party's name. There were not many void-level cultivators. With Sylvia's previous status, it was not surprising that she knew the other party. Huh. You know? An acquaintance? Slowly exhaling the last turbid breath, Tang En looked up and down and asked casually. Shaking her head, Sylvia looked a little disgusted. No, I just heard of him. He has been famous for a long time, and he is good at using a pair of unique iron claws. He likes to cut the enemy into pieces and is extremely cruel. If I remember correctly, his current identity should be the Bran Imperial Court Consecrator. Haha, identity doesn't matter. As long as he has no friendship with you, then this matter is easy to deal with. Listening to Xia Weian's slightly worried introduction, Tang En smiled and did not say much. He raised his hand and pointed at Enchirao without hesitation. Then, he withdrew his hand and slowly slid it across his neck. He grinned, revealing his teeth. Throat cutting. There was no expert in a fight. Since they were enemies, there was nothing much to say. Seeing this, Enchilua's old face instantly turned pale. His robe was fluttering, and a pair of bloody iron claws had appeared on his hands. He waved them and roared, "Boy, you are courting death." At this moment, Enchilua quickly made a decision in his heart. He must personally use his iron claws to cut off every piece of flesh of this ignorant boy. However, as soon as the word death fell, before Enchilua could put his cruel thoughts into action, his vision suddenly blurred, and a demonic blade was directly in front of his throat. Not to mention how scared Enchilua was at this moment, Sylvia below was completely stunned. She was sitting next to Tang En. Just a moment ago, she saw him turn his hand and show the dagger, but the next moment, he suddenly disappeared and appeared in front of Enchilua. It was as if the distance between them did not exist at all. Teleportation? Space magic? Sylvia shook her head subconsciously. Although Tang En's martial arts were a bit strange, in any case, it was within the scope of a warrior. It was absolutely impossible for him to be a space magician. But if that was the case, how did he cross the distance of hundreds of feet in an instant? Roar! Sylvia suppressed the doubts in her heart and was awakened by Enchilua's furious roar. She squinted her eyes and looked up at the sky. Her mouth was half open and she was stunned again. Attack, defense, attack, attack, attack. In just a short moment, the claw shadows were swallowed by the blade lights that were hundreds of times larger than the claw shadows. Even Enchilua's embarrassed body was faintly discernible, and he looked like a small boat on a turbulent sea that was about to fall. Close combat. And it was close combat. Sylvia had fought with Tang En many times, so she was very clear about Tang En's combat style. It was not an exaggeration to say that Sylvia thought that if she was brought into the rhythm of close combat by Tang En on the ground, even if the opponent's combat strength was one level higher than his, it was basically useless. But that was only on the ground. Sylvia did not expect that Tang En's abnormal close combat level was still as sharp as before. This was different from the fierce battle in the air in the academy. At that time, although Tang En also fought in the air, it was obvious that Tang En was not used to it. It was like pulling chestnuts out of the fire, and he almost died trying to find a point to borrow strength from the enemy. This time it was different. Tang En did not deliberately find a point to borrow strength from Enchilua's body, nor did he stand upright in the air. Instead, he used a method similar to teleportation and constantly flashed around Enchilua's body crazily to suppress him. Like a close combat on the ground? These words sounded a bit tongue-twisting, but they were exactly what Xia Weian was feeling right now. She looked at Twain in a daze, as if she was looking at a space magician who seemed to be a monster. He was skillfully using a dagger to engage in hand-to-hand combat with someone, and even had the upper hand in the end. This scene is 2F** King weird. Well, no matter what Sylvia was thinking, she was sure of one thing. This time, the famous and ruthless Enchilua was done for. That was almost the truth. As a space-level powerhouse, Enchilua only said one sentence after entering the arena. After that, he didn't have a chance to speak anymore. He was suppressed endlessly, completely suppressed endlessly. Actually, judging from the iron claws on his hands, this Enchilua should also be an expert in close combat. Perhaps this was also the reason why he had looked at Twain with a somewhat judgmental and disdainful gaze. However, the person he met this time was a real expert. After holding on for about a minute, finally, he was able to get a hold of him. Ah! A shrill scream sounded. Among the sparks, two shadows were suddenly thrown out of the arena, drawing two lines of blood in the air. Those were two iron claws that were cut off from the wrist and connected to the palm. Then, the shrill scream suddenly stopped, like a rooster whose neck was suddenly pinched. In the air, thousands of blade lights disappeared at the same time. Only Tang En was left, holding the dagger with a backhand, twisting his waist and stepping forward, drawing a long and faint blurred line of blood in the air. In front of him, Enchilua's short body leaned back, and his white head was raised high as if he was trying to avoid something. However, the exposed part of his neck had already been marked with a horrifying bloody wound that was so deep that broken bones could be seen. Cutting the throat was also a kind of etiquette. As long as it was a kind of etiquette, it was impossible to take it back. At this moment, the outcome was clear. Life and death were decided. Below, Sylvia looked at this visually shocking scene in a daze. She felt that time seemed to have stopped, and she opened her mouth in a daze, unable to speak. Immediately, the line of blood faded and the corpse fell. Phew! This pervert! She muttered in a low voice and exhaled the turbid air that had been suppressed in her chest for a long time. Sylvia shook her head and retracted her gaze. She pursed her lips and suddenly felt a little disappointed. At this moment, she even suddenly understood Wencelin's mentality. That fellow who had once been chased by him to the northern wasteland in a sorry state and couldn't escape after traveling for thousands of miles seemed to have become even stronger and had left him far behind. No wonder the sword god's disciple, who was like a son of heaven, couldn't help but feel jealous. While she was lost in her thoughts, Sylvia suddenly frowned and turned her head to look to the right. A few feet away, a middle-aged man holding a heavy sword had just turned the corner of the attic. He was panting, and his chest was heaving up and down. It seemed that he had run a long way. It was the Earth Stage warrior who had first discovered Tang En's trace. However, his attention was not on Sylvia, who was very close to him. Instead, he opened his mouth and raised his head, looking at the sky foolishly. As the saying goes, it's better to come early than to come at the right time. The middle-aged man appeared at the right time, just in time for Tang En to kill Enchilua. Of course, if he was given another chance, it was hard to say whether he would still desperately chase after him like this. The next moment, the middle-aged man blinked and blinked again. His already open mouth was even wider, and his face was full of shock and astonishment. It turned out that Tang En, who was still in the air just now, had disappeared in an instant like a light breeze and smoke, disappearing without a trace. Thinking of something, the middle-aged man subconsciously looked around his body. He held his heavy sword tightly, and his expression was a mess of nervousness. However, at this moment, "Are you looking for me?" A palm stretched out from behind and quietly rested on the man's shoulder. The middle-aged man's body suddenly stiffened when he heard the faint voice. "Oh, although I have always thought that cannon fodder should have the consciousness of cannon fodder, your consciousness is too high. Then, goodbye." Chapter 946. The gloomy clouds were still gloomy, and the gloomy color did not increase or decrease. There was only a slight drizzle, which brought a slight coolness to the oppressive atmosphere here. A moment later, on the west wall of the pavilion, the strong Do-Chi fluctuation not long ago was like a firefly in the dark night, quickly attracting a few sensitive experts. Broken throat, plus a sharp blade through the back. TSK. Beautiful, a fatal blow, no room for struggle. Looking at the neat ground around him, the gray-clothed old man put down the corpse in his hand, shook his head and smacked his lips, giving an accurate judgment with some admiration. I said, his close combat ability is very strong. When Scylla frowned at the corpse on the ground, and said with a gloomy face, the reason he was in a bad mood was of course not because the Earth-grade warrior was killed, but because the latter obviously did not take his previous instructions to heart, and dared to approach Tang En so unscrupulously, leading to the failure of the tracking. It's just an Earth-grade warrior, not to mention a sneak attack. The slightly chubby old man with white hair and a rosy face seemed to have a different opinion. He glanced at the corpse indifferently and snorted lightly. Earth-grade strength is not weak, even if it was a sneak attack. To be killed without resistance, the opponent is indeed not simple. And, shaking his head, the gray-clothed old man looked around. Since it was a fatal blow, then the Do-Chi fluctuation we felt before should not be him. Why hasn't Elder An arrived yet? The so-called Elder An was naturally Enchilua. When Scylla and the other two were startled when they heard this. Yes, they could feel the Do-Chi fluctuation, so Enchilua, who was also a void-grade warrior, naturally could feel it. But he had not appeared yet, no need to wait. At this moment, a cold voice suddenly came. In the north of the pavilion, a tall old man with a stiff expression like a tombstone walked over. With a wave of his hand, 2 bloody iron claws and a corpse in a navy blue robe were thrown over, cut off the hand and slit the throat, clean and neat. He can't be more dead. Elder N. Looking at the corpse of Enchilua on the ground with both hands cut off at the wrist and body twisted like a big mouse, when Scylla and the other two could not help but change their expressions and cry out in alarm. How is this possible? From the time we sensed the fluctuation of Do-Chi to the time we rushed here, it was at most 5 minutes. The chubby old man's face was full of shock. He no longer had the relaxed and casual look from before. He subconsciously shook his head and denied. If I hadn't found this pair of iron claws in the vicinity, I wouldn't have believed it either. But now this is the truth. The tall old man squatted and narrowed his eyes. There was a maniacal smile on his cold face as he played with Enchilua's head that was about to fall off. This is a real butcher. Look, the fatal wound was a cut on the neck. From right to left, half of Mr. An's laryngeal bones were broken instantly. The strength was impeccable. Beautiful. In this way, he could guarantee an instant kill, but at the same time, his head wouldn't be chopped off on the spot, nor would it fall from a high altitude and lose its beauty. TSK. Perfect. He smacked his lips and felt satisfied as if he had just eaten a sumptuous feast. Then, he put on a serious face and said, "Look here. He must have fallen from a high altitude, so Elder An's face was preserved very well. This should be considered a blessing in disguise. At least he didn't need to be sewn up when he was buried." He waved his hand and said, "Of course, this isn't the main point. The main point is that Elder An's expression was preserved perfectly before he died." Pain and shock? Thinking, the tall old man raised his blood-stained finger and touched his chin, trying to reconstruct the scene. This scene made the corners of Wensilin and the others' mouths twitch. However, Wensilin didn't seem to feel anything and continued to analyze. It's not difficult to understand the pain. Let me guess, this should be caused by Elder An's hands being chopped off before his throat was cut. As for shock, Elder An was a person who had seen many big scenes. Whether it was knowledge, experience, combat experience, etc., he was extremely rich. What exactly did he see to make him so shocked? I'm really curious. After thinking for a while, the tall old man shook his head regretfully. Unfortunately, the battle was too short. There wasn't even any fresh blood on Elder An's iron claws. He couldn't hurt his opponent at all and was simply killed. In this way, there are fewer clues for analysis. from the current situation, we can only know that Elder N was thrown down from a high altitude after his throat was cut. In other words, Elder N fought with the opponent in the air, and it should be a head-on battle. Pause for a while, he took a slight breath, looked up at the stunned Wensilin, and asked coldly, "I think you need to give us an explanation. In addition to being good at close combat, does that Tang En really only have the strength of early-stage void level?" As soon as the words fell, the expressions of the other two old men changed again, and they looked at Wensilin in surprise. They couldn't be blamed for this reaction. Enchilua's body was in front of them, and anyone could see how he died. And in just a few minutes, a void-level martial artist was simply killed, and it was in the air where he could freely advance and retreat. This sounded too shocking, because this meant that the opponent's strength was likely to have an absolute overwhelming advantage. Otherwise, even if a void-level martial artist couldn't win, he shouldn't have no chance to escape. Wensilin was also confused at this moment, and he couldn't believe what he saw in front of him. However, it wasn't easy for him to persuade a few void-level martial artists to come together. Of course, he wouldn't say that the information here might be wrong. Gritting his teeth, he braced himself and said, "There must be something wrong here. That Tang En's strength is indeed only early-stage void level. And Master also tested it not long ago, it can't be wrong." The three old men certainly knew who Wensilin's master was. Hearing him mention that person, they naturally had no doubts about this judgment. But at the same time, the tall old man frowned. Sword God also made a move, but he couldn't kill the other party? The matter of Wu Ding and Tang En's fight involved too many people. If they were not careful, the news that Sword God had gone to the north could be revealed, so Wensilin didn't dare to say it before. But now that the three void-level martial artists who didn't know about it reacted, their hearts suddenly sank. Think about it, even Sword God couldn't take him down. What kind of terrifying strength did the other party have? Wensilin quickly explained, Master only used one sword at that time, and he didn't use his full strength. Moreover, let's not talk about the level of strength. In a while, you will know how treacherous and cunning that assassin guy is. Yes, it must be like this. Olden must have fallen into his trap, that's why he was quickly killed. At this point, Wensilin of course had to infinitely belittle the situation at that time, and by the way, infinitely raise the image of Tang En as a sinister and cunning person who liked to use petty tricks to defeat his opponents. Of course, the latter was no pressure at all. The three old men looked at each other when they heard this. Although they were somewhat dissatisfied with Wensilin for not saying anything, since they were already here, regardless of Wensilin's family background, they couldn't just turn around and leave. In the end, they all nodded slightly. Seeing this, Wensilin's heart was relieved. While ordering his subordinates to collect Enchilua's body, he said seriously, Old Anne's death was an accident and a regrettable warning. Once again, I repeat to everyone that Tang En is really sinister and dangerous. Everyone must be careful not to let him get close, otherwise the consequences will be unpredictable. In fact, Wensilin had already said this many times when he came here. But masters were all proud, including Wensilin. If he hadn't suffered a big loss at the hands of Tang En, how could he be so afraid? So at that time, although the four Void Masters looked at Wensilin's background, they were very polite and took note of it. But in fact, they didn't think so. The so-called close combat, in their eyes, was just a petty way of fighting that those low-level cultivators who hadn't broken through to the Earth stage and couldn't control the vast do-chi between heaven and earth would specialize in. But now looking at Enchilua, whose strength was similar to theirs, and the bloody wound on his neck that was so deep that the bone could be seen, the three Void Masters didn't dare to be careless. They all nodded solemnly. You stay here and collect Old Anne's body. When this matter is over, immediately transport it back and give it a grand burial. Everyone, let's continue the chase. After giving orders to his subordinates, when Scylla immediately turned to look at the three Void Masters. The restriction on Sylvia's body hasn't been lifted, so Tang Yen can't have run far. He should be in front. Let's speed up now and take revenge for Olden. P.S. Sorry, it's been delayed until now. Civet has something important to do today. And actually, I mentioned it once before. Sister Civet is not in good health. She has cancer and had an operation. But she couldn't cure it, and it shouldn't be cured. She has to go to Beijing Hospital for a checkup every few months, so today I sent her to the train station. I only rushed this chapter after I came back. Sorry again. Chapter 947. Tang Yen indeed did not run far. After when Scylla and the others continued to fly forward for a few minutes, their figures paused one after another as they sensed something. Their gazes were all cast towards the slightly messy place below. This was a slum-like existence, and it was also the landmark area of almost every Brand city's southern district. Since it was a slum, it was inevitable that it would be chaotic and desolate. In fact, this was exactly the case. Looking down, it was full of ordinary tiled houses of varying heights and grayness. A few simple clothes were hung up in a few courtyards to dry, which meant that there were still people living inside. However, most of the courtyards were overgrown with weed. It was obvious that they had been abandoned or had become the temporary residence of homeless people. Interspersed among the countless houses were potholed streets, messy alleys, and so on. All kinds of shabby debris were scattered all over the place, faintly emitting a faint odor, causing people to shrink back. In short, this was a chaotic place with a complicated terrain and a harsh environment. Anyone with a bit of wealth would not be willing to set foot in this place. But now, when Scylla and the others, whose identities could definitely be considered noble, had come, and they were looking at it very seriously. It was as if they wanted to see a beautiful flower in this harsh soil. After a moment, the gray-robed old man was the first to withdraw his gaze. He shook his head and laughed. Hee, it seems that our prey is very confident. He wants to be a hunter again. Generally speaking, anyone who could be called an expert would have extremely sensitive senses. This was not a mysterious statement to scare people, but a perception of the external environment after many years of actual combat and cultivation. The specific manifestation was that when one was being spied on maliciously, even if one was in a bustling crowd, one's state of mind would secretly fluctuate and lock onto the other party's location. Of course, if both sides were experts, and the spying party was good at concealing themselves, then this perception would be reduced to the minimum and almost undetectable. There was no doubt that Tang Yen's attainments in concealing his aura and disguising himself did not need to be said. When Scylla and the others knew very well that they could not compare to him. But now they still felt that they were being spied on, which could only mean that Tang Yen was doing this on purpose. In other words, Tang Yen would no longer run and hide like before. Instead, he decided to counterattack on the spot. This was the battlefield. The surroundings have been completely sealed off. He should know that it's impossible for him to escape silently. Haha, looks like I've really made a good move. Winston laughed. He was a little surprised, but also a little proud. The so-called good chess piece was naturally the restriction on Xiao Wei An's body. With Tang Yen's speed, if he were to break out of the encirclement alone, when Scylla and the others really had no confidence in stopping him. But if Tang Yen insisted on saving Sylvia, he wouldn't be able to escape from this area with her dragging him down. Now it seemed that Tang Yen really valued Sylvia very much, to the point that he didn't even hesitate to risk his life for her. Of course, there was another possibility, which was that Tang Yen had the confidence to fight 1 against 4 and planned to kill them before leaving. However, when Scylla and the others didn't even think about it. What kind of joke was this? The 4 of them weren't random people, they were real Void Masters. The terrain here. Frowning slightly, the tall old man looked at the messy environment below and shook his head. It's troublesome. It's just a sneak attack. The slightly chubby old man curled his lip. Although they had learned from Enchilua's mistake, they were already wary of Tang En and didn't dare to be careless. But they still subconsciously despised his fighting style. As long as we're careful and don't leave each other's sight, what can he do to us? Then let's do it. The area here isn't big. Even if we search inch by inch, it won't take long. In order to avoid trouble, Wensilin immediately made the decision. He then cupped his hands and bowed to the tall old man. Old Fei, please be the bait. The so-called bait naturally meant to go down to the ground to search and lure Tang En to appear. After all, although the view from above was vast, there were always some details that couldn't be observed from above. There was no doubt that with Tang En's abnormal close combat ability, doing this was naturally extremely dangerous. However, the tall old man called Old Fei didn't refuse. He nodded expressionlessly and slowly landed on the street below. Immediately after, Wensilin and the other two spread out in the air. With the tall old man as the center, they stood in the air with a distance of more than 10 feet. At first glance, the four people who maintained a distance between them looked like a small battle formation, and it was the kind that was three-dimensional on land and air. It was amazing. In fact, the truth was more or less like this. A battle formation formed by 4 void stage martial artists was not unprecedented, but its power was definitely not inferior to a normal battle formation in the sense of the word. It might even be better. And this battle formation, as if they were facing a great enemy, was indeed enough to give Tang En face. They weren't worried that Tang En wouldn't make a move because he couldn't escape at all. And this place was only so big they could always find him. So from this point of view, if he didn't want to be forced into a desperate situation and only counterattacked, Tang En would definitely choose to make a move. Therefore, Wensilin and the others were very patient. In the past, they could fly back and forth several miles in an instant, but now they were moving at a speed similar to that of a tortoise, a snail, and other heavy animals. They followed the tall old man below, carefully exploring step by step. This place was really messy and very deserted. There was basically no one on the street that wasn't very wide. Perhaps it was because they hadn't returned from the square yet, but the clothes that fluttered back and forth in the drizzle in the courtyards were also ignored. The only source of sound was the sound of the debris on the street being swept up by the cold wind, tumbling along the way. This was the slum. Silent, so silent that there wasn't the slightest bit of life. After a while, they walked through a complete street. Suddenly, with a soft paw, the outer window of the 2-story building on the right side of the street was tightly shut. And before the window was closed, the tall old man had already moved his gaze over and saw a sallow and emaciated face filled with fear. That unconcealable fear, even after the window was closed, could still be clearly felt through the trembling eyes behind the broken glass. There was no doubt that this was a local resident, which was a poor person. And when a poor person looked through the window of his house and suddenly saw someone walking in the air outside, other than closing the window in fear, what else could he do? It was just a small episode. Wensilin and the others didn't care, and the tall old man didn't care either. He naturally retracted his gaze. The next moment, his pupils shrank sharply. Hiss, like the sound of the wind, the imperceptible blade light was like drifting raindrops, directly in front of his eyes. The space between his eyebrows trembled. No one knew where this blade light appeared from, and it was delivered in front of him. Even the heart of the experienced void realm didn't have the slightest ripple. If he didn't turn his head and see it with his own eyes, this blade light would feel no different from the thousands of raindrops around him. But this wasn't real rain after all, or even if it was still a fatal rain. No one dared to let it drip between the eyebrows. However, ding! The tall old man didn't dodge or let it go. He watched expressionlessly as the blade light pierced between his eyebrows. Then, an inch away from his skin, the cold blade light suddenly stopped, making a crisp sound like metal colliding. At the same time, a layer of colorless transparent barrier lit up around the tall old man's body. It was slightly rippling, with sharp edges and corners like an armor. In fact, this was an armor, a do-chi armor. But what was different from ordinary martial artists was that the tall old man's do-chi armor was stronger and more concealed. He believed that if it wasn't triggered by this blade light, no one would be able to see that he was covered with a do-chi armor. This was why when Silen asked him to be bait, and why the tall old man didn't refuse. He was indeed the most suitable candidate to be bait in this group of people, and the facts proved that this was the case. Looking up and looking at the figure dressed as a light knight in front of him, the tall old man frowned regretfully. To be honest, you have disappointed me a little. Haha, you finally appeared. Twain, you've finally revealed yourself. He roared with laughter towards the sky, and it was filled with the wild joy and complacency of his scheme succeeding. At this moment, when Silen's heart was filled with an irrepressible sense of accomplishment. So what if you are fast? So what if you are talented? Insidious and cunning. You are insidious and cunning, but didn't you still fall into my trap? Compared to when Silen's excitement, the other two void-level old men in the air were also happy, but after all, they had never suffered a loss in the hands of Tang En, so they didn't have much emotion. Seeing this, they quickly surrounded, but did not rush to attack. Instead, they controlled the surrounding area at the first moment, cutting off the escape route of Tang En, who was said to be extremely fast. This was a real desperate situation. The few people present firmly believed that Tang En, who had fallen into the trap, could not escape, and could only accept the fate of being strangled. Chapter 948. The characteristics of close combat were very clear: speed and intensity. And because of the narrow space, every move was usually a killing move that could decide life and death in minutes. It was extremely exciting, and it was not an exaggeration to say that it was a game for the brave. At the same time, because of these characteristics, once the close combat circle was formed, outsiders would be afraid of accidentally injuring and would find it extremely difficult to intervene. Therefore, when Silen and the others were worthy of being called void-level masters who had experienced hundreds of battles, they did not rush to encircle him, but instead chose to seal off the surroundings. Of course, they did this because they believed in their companion, the expressionless Old Fei. As a matter of fact, Old Fei didn't let them down and had even exceeded their expectations. To be honest, I'm a bit disappointed. Raising his hand, an icy blue light suddenly bloomed, instantly covering the entire street and sweeping the whole place. It was as if a strong storm had swept over, and the debris on the ground all around were whirled and scattered in all directions. The scene was spectacular for a moment. He did not passively defend and wait for his companions to help, nor did he fear close combat by flying into the air to dodge. This Old Fei seemed to be extremely confident, choosing to counterattack at the first moment. The strong demeanor of a void-level master was clearly visible. If one attack did not succeed, he would instantly escape. This was the normal way of an assassin. However, Tang En, who was shrouded in the blue light, did not do so. Instead, he raised his dagger, his figure flashing around the tall old man like a ghost. Thousands of light blades madly attacked like rain, as if he wanted to use this to forcefully kill the target. However, ding ding ding. Old Fei's expression became even more disappointed. He allowed the dense light blades to hit his body, shining like countless sparks, but he did not move. Shaking his head, "Your movement is not bad, your speed is not bad. But your strength is too weak. What's more serious is that you do not know how to judge the situation, impulsive and stupid. It's really a collapse mess." Without answering, Tang En continued to attack, as if he was looking forward to which blade could penetrate the old man's defense. "Your mother, why don't you make a move? although it was very satisfying to hear, when Silin was more concerned about such a good opportunity to kill Tang En in one fell swoop. He could not help but anxiously curse in his heart. It was as if he had heard Silin's thoughts, or as if Elder Fei was angered by this person who was weaker than he had imagined. The difference was too great, and he felt a sense of humiliation as if he had been toyed with. After criticizing him word by word, he no longer hesitated. He held his arms in front of his chest, allowing the blade light to penetrate the vital point of Zhongmen Dekong's heart, and suddenly pushed it out. Swoosh! His robes fluttered as icy blue pillar-shaped fighting lights burst out from between his palms. They were like surging waves as they slammed down madly. Each wave was higher than the last, and they instantly drowned Tang En's figure, who couldn't dodge in time. Although there was some disdain in his words, someone like Old Fei would naturally not be careless in a battle and would go all out. This ice-blue dough light that was like a turbulent sea wave was the purest form of dough qi, without the slightest bit of finesse. Its purpose was to use force to suppress others. This was what it meant to defeat Ten intellect with brute force. In the face of true power, schemes, tricks, speed, and so on were all meaningless. Reality proved that Old Fei's cautiousness was not excessive. Just as the pillar light was about to pass through the entire street, Tang En's figure suddenly struggled out from it, and staggered as if he was about to fall. Immediately after, boom! The abandoned building behind him became a substitute victim, and was instantly hit by the icy blue dough light from the front. Gravel and wood immediately flew in all directions, exploding and shattering. Let's end this battle without any suspense. Shaking his head in disappointment, Old Fei's figure suddenly charged forward, ignoring the dagger that pierced towards him. His right palm that contained a berserk dough light slammed down like thunder, instantly destroying Tang En's weak defense and hitting the top of his head. Boom! The dough light violently exploded, and a strong wind blew in all directions. The gravel and wood that had just flown out were immediately swept back, and the area was instantly cleared. Other than Old Fei, who had not yet retracted his palm, there were no other figures within a few feet of him. It was as if Tang En had been smashed into nothingness by the power of this palm. Silence. Dead. Dead. Just like that. He died? The battle between the two sides actually did not last for long. Just as when Silin and the others stood in their positions and raised their heads, the battle was over. This situation was undoubtedly out of everyone's expectations. The two void-level old men looked at each other with slight surprise, and then turned to look at Silin with a strange expression. This is the close combat strength that you have emphasized 100 times, the fierce person that can withstand the sword god's sword? Are you joking? Or is the sword god joking? Of course, Silin was not joking. In fact, the shock and astonishment on his face was clearly much stronger than the two void-level old men. He looked down in a daze, and his expression was filled with confusion. Yes, it was not ecstasy, but confusion. Dead? He actually died just like that. It shouldn't be. Subconsciously grabbing his hair, Silin was at a loss. He had suffered a great loss at the hands of Tang En. Even if he did not accept it verbally, but in his heart, he actually acknowledged the other's strength. When he came, he had thought of all kinds of unexpected situations, and had made all the preparations he could think of, including a bitter battle, a tragic victory, and even mental preparation for failure. The only thing he had never thought of was the possibility of an easy victory. In his opinion, this was something that was completely impossible, and it was meaningless to think about it. But now this situation had happened, and it was right under his nose. It was as if he had lost something, when Silin and the others, who were in a state of shock and had not recovered from their shock, did not see that Elder Fei was also shocked below. However, what was different from their shock was that Elder Fei was not surprised by Tang En's death, but was at a loss for the palm strike just now. Just now, it seemed that he did not hit the real thing. It was light, as if he was hitting a shadow? His expression suddenly changed. That's not right. Before he finished speaking, suddenly, a mournful scream resounded through the sky. The scream came from the left side of the sky, and the one guarding there was a slightly fat old man. In fact, he did not realize what had happened at all. It was just that in the previous moment, he suddenly felt that the surrounding temperature had plummeted, and the chill was bone-chilling, as if he had fallen into an ice cellar. Killing intent. Before his mind could react, his battle-hardened nerves were a step ahead of him, and his body tilted to the side. Immediately, the slightly fat old man felt a sudden chill on his right shoulder, and blood spurted out. He looked on helplessly as his entire arm was cut off at the shoulder and scattered into the sky. He opened his mouth and screamed and retreated. Damn it! Elder Fei was the first to react. He suddenly turned his head, and saw that the figure that he had hit on the head had appeared beside the slightly fat old man at some point in time, and coldly waved a dagger to cut off his arm. Don't retreat. Looking at the slightly fat old man who had subconsciously retreated, Elder Fei, who had already soared into the sky, suddenly became anxious. Although he did not know what he had just fought with, and what strange situation had happened. That Tang Yin did not die was a fact, and this also meant that the other party was not simple. Thinking back to Wen Silin's previous warning, the other party's speed was extremely fast. Now that the slightly fat old man had subconsciously chosen to retreat, not only would he not be able to avoid the other party's pursuit, but he would also increase the distance between them, and it would be difficult to rescue him. Fight, fight. Sure enough, the anxious Elder Fei's expression suddenly froze. He saw that Tang Yin suddenly flash in the air, and instantly appeared beside the slightly fat old man who had retreated dozens of feet away. He waved his dagger, and countless blade lights scattered, and in an instant, streams of blood were drawn. Immediately after, he flashed again, and like a shadow, he instantly appeared beside the slightly fat old man, and continued to wave his dagger. It was not that the slightly fat old man did not counterattack, but his counterattack was too slow, too slow. Before he could even throw out a punch, his body had already been hit by more than 10 blades. Before he could explode with Do Qi, the blade lights had already reached his vitals. He could only dodge and retreat, and continuously dodge and retreat in a sorry state. Teleport? Teleport? When Silin and the others finally saw what close combat in the sky was, and also finally understood how Enchilua had died before. Under this kind of teleportation that was completely undefendable, it was almost impossible to not be closed in. And once they were closed in, they would be completely suppressed, and there would be almost no way to fight back. How could they fight like this? Don't retreat. Here, come here. Damn it. When Silin and the others roared angrily. They had never felt that their speed was actually so slow. They could not catch up with the slightly fat old man who was retreating, and they could not catch up with Tang Yin who seemed to be teleporting. They could only follow behind bitterly, and watch as their companions were completely suppressed, but they were unable to lend a helping hand. And that slightly fat old man seemed to have been completely beaten into a daze, and he could not hear any warning at all. He screamed again and again, like a wild rabbit being chased by a cheetah. The only thought in his mind was to escape, to keep escaping, to get as far away from this demon who was like a maggot in his bones, as far as possible, as far as possible. But this was destined to be a delusion. Sir System was very considerate, and promptly sent the Permitha teleportation skill. The current Tang Yin had completely changed from a bird gun to a cannon. It was no longer like before, where even if he met a cat or a dog who was not as strong as him, as long as he could fly, he could only watch and passively take a beating. Although he still could not fly, he did not have to hold any resentment towards this. Under the Permitha teleportation skill, as long as it was within range, he could arrive in an instant and launch an attack. Moreover, to create such a battle environment, Tang En also paid a price. The shadow clone was blasted into pieces by the tall old man. Although it would not hurt Tang En's muscles and bones, it was inevitable that he would be injured. This was the skill's limitation and could not be changed. Fortunately, the effect was good, and he succeeded in making Wensilin and the others, who had never seen such a strange skill, fall into an instant of shock, and since he had paid a heavy price, how could Tang En let this fat piece of meat, which was also the slightly fat old man, escape? For an expert, an instant was enough to determine the outcome of a battle. While you are sick, I will take your life and pursue you fiercely. The slightly fat old man's mind was already in chaos, and he had completely lost the thought of resisting. Other than subconsciously blocking his vital parts, defense had also become an extravagant hope. He was like a weak woman who had been stripped naked, and other than screaming, there was nothing else. This feeling of being at a loss was very unfamiliar to the slightly fat old man. To be exact, ever since he reached the void level, he had never been in such a sorry state. Every time he made a move, he did not treat the opponent like an ant in the palm of his hand and control their life and death. But now, he felt that he had become that insignificant ant. Then, he became even more terrified. Chapter 949. It had to be said that although the malice attached to the fatty in this world was as vast as the mountains and seas, there were two sides to the story. If one looked at it from a different perspective, this was actually an advantage. For example, the fate of this slightly fat old man, if it was a slightly thinner person, under Tang En's relentless pursuit, not to mention whether or not he would be able to hold on for such a long time, just the blood that spurted out would be enough to take away half of his life. However, the slightly fat old man was still alive. Although he was still in a sorry state, his screams were full of energy. It was obvious that he would not die in a short period of time. Of course, this slight advantage was not enough to reverse the situation, nor could it save him from a tragic fate. This point, the slightly fat old man was very clear in his heart. Tang En was also very clear, and when Wensilin and the others saw it even more clearly, he decisively roared, "Attack, attack!" There was no hope in chasing, and there was no result in reminding. Finally, when Wensilin, who had exhausted his patience, could no longer endure this passive situation. With a wave of his long spear, the green and purple Dookie suddenly erupted. Old Fei and the other two were stunned when they heard this, and then their expressions changed slightly. Just as they had said before, it was not easy to interfere in close combat, not to mention that they were not close at all. If they attacked in this situation, it would undoubtedly cover the slightly fat old man as well. Wensilin's attack was very decisive, and the current weather was also very beneficial for him to display his Do Qi. As soon as the roar fell, the green and purple spear light was like lightning in the clouds, instantly streaking across the evening sky and falling rain, directly attacking Tang En's back. Of course, the situation of the battle was constantly changing, and with Tang En's ghostly movements, this spear seemed to be aimed at Tang En's back, but in reality, it was not much different from attacking both of them at the same time. The slightly fat old man, who was dizzy and only relied on his instincts to escape, did not notice this malicious attack. Tang En saw it. Although he felt that the character of this sword god's last disciple was not good, and that he was vicious and merciless, he could still be considered a kindred spirit. However, for this great opportunity that was hard to create, Tang En naturally could not afford to lose it. As he drew his blade, he suddenly kicked the slightly fat old man's lower abdomen, sending him flying a few meters away. He retched and howled miserably. Ouch! Cough cough. After being stunned for a moment, Tang En's face suddenly lit up. It turned out that this kick had not only allowed the two of them to dodge the lightning-like spear light at the same time, but it had also created a fatal opportunity. His lower abdomen felt as if it had been hit head-on by a speeding carriage. Naturally, the pain was unbearable. The slightly plump old man could not help but bend his waist and stretch his neck, making an appearance as if he was singing to the sky. This posture coincidentally caused the chubby old man to reveal his vital spot at that moment. That was his fat neck. This was a great opportunity, just like in the movie East Becomes West in the modern world, where Hong Qigong couldn't bear to use the divine dragon tail to kick Ouyang Feng. There was no other reason other than the fact that his posture was so handsome that it would be embarrassing if she didn't kick him. Tang En laughed loudly while holding such a joyful mood. Then, in an instant, he charged forward. Their shadows intersected and brushed past each other. An almost undetectable silver-white blade light flashed through the fine rain. In the next moment, the figure of the slightly plump old man suddenly stiffened, and the miserable howl came to an abrupt end. "Be careful!" "Stop!" The alarm came too late. If Tang En could see this opportunity, Old Fei and the others behind him could naturally see it too. It was just that they were too far away. They could only watch as Tang En quickly waved his dagger, drawing an elegant arc in the drizzle, and instantly piercing the chubby old man's fat neck. "It's over." Not to mention that the slightly plump old man did not have a steel defense like Old Fei. Even Old Fei, looking at that soul-stirring dreamy arc, couldn't help but feel nervous. So, there was no need to mention the slightly plump old man who was dizzy and had almost no consciousness to resist. Another void-level powerhouse, another slash to the throat. Was there a need for this battle to continue? While they were in a daze, Old Fei and Old Fei's eyes suddenly lit up. Die! Thunder thundered. Several streaks of purple lightning accompanied by a tyrannical roar instantly struck down from the gray clouds, accurately enveloping Tang En and the slightly plump old man's surroundings. The power was terrifying. Immediately, bang! Wherever the lightning touched, a large piece of flesh suddenly exploded and splashed out. A bloody mist rose, blowing along with the cool wind, and there was a faint smell of roasted meat. Of course, it was the kind that was roasted. Needless to say, this was naturally Wen Silen's move again. In the eyes of Tang En and Old Fei, that opportunity just now was a chance to endanger the life of the slightly plump old man. But in Wen Silen's eyes, it was also a good opportunity to kill Tang En. Since he couldn't save him anyway, he might as well take advantage of the time when Tang En killed the slightly plump old man and decisively use his killing move. If he could use this opportunity to kill or seriously injure Tang En, then the slightly plump old man would not have died in vain. It had to be said that Wen Silen's brain was still very flexible. In an instant, he had sorted out the various relationships and found the method that was most in line with his own interests. Perhaps this was the so-called elite education that large families cultivated from a young age. However, the lightning flashed, and when the needle-like drizzle quickly fell to the ground with a large piece of bloody mist. Wen Silen narrowed his eyes and looked carefully. The area in the sky was already empty, and there was no trace of a person. Naturally, Wen Silen would not make the same mistake a second time. He immediately put away his spear and stood in the air, looking around vigilantly. At this time, Old Fei and the other person also reacted. First, they looked at the pieces of charred meat that fell on the roof below the area, and the corners of their eyes twitched a few times. Then, they looked at Wen Silen with a complicated expression, shook their heads slightly, and finally looked down as well. Although they were all void-level powerhouses and also came together, the relationship between Old Fei and the others was not necessarily that close. It was only because everyone's status was equal and their strength was similar, so it was inevitable that they would have some friendship. As for risking their lives for revenge, that was out of the question. But the fox grieves for the rabbit's death. This did not mean that they did not have any objections to Wen Silen's actions. After all, taking advantage of the danger of his companions to launch an attack without caring about anything, and in the end, causing his companions to not even have a complete corpse left, This method was really chilling, however. When they looked at each other, Old Fay and the other person couldn't help but smile bitterly. As matters stood, as long as Wensillen didn't want to leave, then even if they wanted to retreat, there was nothing they could do. After all, Wensillen had come with them. If something happened to Wensillen in the end, then even if they managed to escape, how would they explain it to the Wensillen family and the Sword God? Shaking their heads again, Old Fay and the other person couldn't help but sigh in their hearts. This time, it seems like we shouldn't have come. Now that they had come, they could only pray that the lightning would hit Tang An as they wished, so that the slightly fat old man's death would be worth it. However, in the next moment, boom! Dozens of meters away, beside the street below, a figure suddenly appeared out of thin air and fell down, smashing into the wall of the alley, causing dust to fly everywhere. Winston and the others abruptly turned their heads to look. Cough, cough. After a series of coughs, a slightly disheveled figure quickly leapt out from the dust. Dressed in the Knight of Light's armor, who else could it be but Twain? It was just that Tang An's external appearance was somewhat miserable. His face was black and gray, his hair was in a mess, and the tattered light armor hung on his body. It was easy to see the large and small blood stains all over his body. Of course, most of them were not his own. It could be seen that the killing just now, especially Wensillen's final lightning sneak attack, had caused Tang An to pay a heavy price. But so what? The head in his right hand, the head of a void-level powerhouse, had already explained everything. To be able to exchange a light injury for the life of a void-level powerhouse, no matter how one looked at it, this deal was definitely profitable. Cough, you seem to be very shocked? Why? Looking up, seemingly innocently looking at Wensillen and the others, Tang An raised the head in his hand and said casually, "It's just a sneak attack. What do you think? What do you think?" Of course, the head would not answer, and Wensillen and the others' faces suddenly darkened when they heard this, and there was a faint hint of anger. It's just a sneak attack. Wasn't this disdainful sentence what the chubby old man had said before, and what they tacitly agreed with? Now, the other party had indeed launched a sneak attack, but it had achieved excellent results. It had to be said that this was really a wonderful irony, and also a resounding slap in the face, making Wensillen and the others feel ashamed and speechless. Casually throwing away the head and patting it, Tang An looked up at Wensillen and continued, "To be honest, I don't understand what you rich second generations are thinking. As the saying goes, if you make a mistake, you have to admit it. Since you have been taught a lesson, you should just stay put. Why do you have to learn from children to play revenge, and even bring people over? Haha, is there any point? Why don't you just bring the nanny over? You bastard, shut up! Yo, you're angry out of humiliation." Touching his nose and looking at Wensillen and the others whose faces had turned from black to green, Tang An spread his hands casually. "Well, in fact, what I want to say is, well, since you're already here, then stay." As soon as he finished speaking, a dagger appeared in his hand. His figure flashed. This was taking the initiative to attack. Chapter 950. Since he had decided to take the initiative to attack, Tang An must be confident. But let's not talk about the battle for now. Outside the slums, a luxurious carriage was slowly driving in from the south with a few knights in tow. Ah, why is the carriage shaking so much? Do you know how to drive a carriage? Coachman, coachman. In the constantly shaking carriage, Annika held onto the inner wall of the carriage as she angrily shouted. Betsy opened the curtains and looked outside. She shook her head and advised, "All right, Annika. It's not the coachman's problem. The road is too bumpy." She also leaned out to take a look. She immediately frowned and wanted to say something. The carriage suddenly shook violently again. With a bang, she was jolted back into her seat. She immediately rubbed her butt with a bitter expression and complained, "So annoying! Why is there such a broken road in Songhai City? What is the Department of Construction doing? It's normal. This is the slums. Annika was different from the spoiled Annika, who had only been to the slums a few times in her life. Betsy, who was engrossed in business and had traveled extensively, was much calmer even though she had seen many things. She consoled, "Bear with it a little longer. It'll be fine once we take a detour." She paused and said helplessly, "After all, this is our only way out now." That was the truth. When the chaos had erupted in the square, Betsy had immediately sensed that the situation was not good and had decisively left with Annika first. But they had come in a carriage. Before they could even drive out of a block, the road was filled with people who had scattered in all directions. When their lives were in danger, the people naturally did not care about the nobles' carriages. Betsy's carriage thus became a sea of people. They could not move forward. This situation was undoubtedly extremely dangerous. If there was any more chaos, the people would definitely not mind overturning a noble's carriage in order to escape. Helpless, after discussing with the knights, the carriage turned around and went in the opposite direction. They did not go to the bustling area of the city, but instead went deeper into the southern part of the city and planned to take a detour. "It's all Alan's fault, and that bad guy Philip's fault. Why else would we come and watch such a cruel trial? Otherwise, how would we have ended up in such a state?" Seeing that things were set in stone, Annika immediately changed her tone and started complaining about Alan and Selina. Then, she thought of something and asked curiously, "By the way, Sister Betsy, was that Sylvia really burned to death?" Annika was a coward. Even though she had coincidentally arrived at the scene of the trial, she still couldn't bear to close her eyes when the trial platform was lit up. She didn't dare to watch this cruel scene. After hesitating for a moment, Betsy shook her head. "I don't think so. But when I left, I noticed that the people who robbed the execution ground earlier were retreating. This means that Sylvia should have been rescued by someone." "Phew! That's good. Burning someone alive is too cruel." Having never seen the viciousness of the human heart, her heart naturally wouldn't be that hard. Even though Annika knew from the rumors and the reactions of the crowd that Sylvia seemed to have committed grave sins, she still couldn't help but heave a sigh of relief when she knew that she hadn't been cruelly burned to death. She patted her chest and comforted herself. Seeing this, Betsy smiled and didn't say anything. She seemed to be in a daze. A few years ago, her personality was similar to her sister's. Born in a noble family, it was inevitable that she would be arrogant and willful, but her heart wasn't that bad. She was even a little naive, like a child, without a clear concept of good and evil. But after experiencing some things, such as the shock of losing a loved one, she knew that in this world, evil people didn't need to be forgiven. They only needed to be hanged. Annika opened her mouth to say something, but swallowed her words when she saw Betsy's expression. She shook her head and was a little puzzled. Why did her usually capable sister like to be in a daze recently? Then, just as the bumpy carriage fell into a short silence, suddenly boom! A deafening sound suddenly rang out clearly, like a sudden clap of thunder exploding in their ears. It caused Betsy and Annika's delicate bodies to shake at the same time. They couldn't help but reveal a panicked expression as they subconsciously turned to look out the window. They were stunned. In the gray sky not far away, an awe-inspiring wave of air shot up into the sky, straight into the clouds. Then, a large expanse of rolling gray fog followed closely behind, rising and spreading wantonly. It instantly enveloped the entire area, its might truly frightening. Nay, the carriage in front seemed to have been startled by this sudden loud sound, and it immediately neighed loudly, causing the carriage to tremble. Fortunately, the carriage wasn't fast, and the coachman's driving skills weren't bad. After a few moments of fluster and continuous shouting, the carriage finally came to a steady stop. Annika cried out involuntarily. What's going on, Sister Betsy?" Annika instantly paled as she grasped the armrest of the seat, her voice trembling as she asked. Betsy also didn't know what had happened, but she was much calmer. After a short moment of panic, she immediately looked at the professionals, the family guards who were guarding the carriage. "Miss, we must leave here as soon as possible." The middle-aged guard captain quickly rode his horse closer, his expression solemn. "There should be someone fighting there, and their strength is very high, very high." Betsy was stunned when she heard this. This middle-aged guard captain was one of the few experts in the family, and used to follow her father, the old count. Later, when she took over the family business and needed to run around, the family transferred him to protect her safety. Now, they hadn't even officially met the other party, but he said that the other party's strength was very high. The meaning of this was self-evident. She took a slight breath, decisively opened the door, and ordered, "Abandon the carriage. Quick, Annika, let's ride the horse and leave in the opposite direction." Pitter-patter-patter. The drifting rain was still stubbornly falling, bringing some refreshment, and slightly dispersing the haze that shrouded the city. However, when it fell on the present Sillin, it only felt abnormally cold, and went straight to the bottom of his heart. He didn't know, or rather, he didn't understand what had happened. The middle-aged guard's eyesight was not bad. Not far away there was indeed a battle between experts, and it was 1 against 3, an extremely rare scene of a chaotic battle between experts of the void level. And since it was 1 against 3, according to common sense, it should be a siege. But now, wiping the rain off his face, it was actually mostly sweat. Enduring the pain of his lower abdomen being kicked, Sillin raised his head and looked at old Fay, who had broken through countless walls with his back more than 10 feet away. Under the crazy attacks of a ghostly figure around him, he blocked left and right and screamed continuously. He no longer had the calm look he had before, and was in a sorry state, and not far from the two, the gray-robed old man holding a one-handed sword was also not relaxed, his expression dignified and conflicted. Because so long as he stepped forward and interfered in the battle, or even if he didn't interfere, but so long as he revealed a flaw, that ghostly figure would instantly flash over and immediately launch a storm of attacks that forced him to retreat repeatedly. And as soon as he retreated, seeing that there was no advantage to be taken, that ghostly figure instantly flashed back and attacked old Fay again. It was obviously a two-front battle. Even if he was fast enough to not be flustered, it was still a fact that he was besieged. But this fact had no effect on this ghostly figure, that is, Tang En. He came and went like the wind, attacking wherever he pointed. There was no pressure, very relaxed. Or it was more than that, because he had also participated in the attack before, which was a three-front battle. But this Tang En still came and went as he pleased, and could even seize the opportunity to kick him, who was relatively the weakest, away. They have the advantage in numbers, but the 3 void-level martial artists are suppressed by one person, playing around in circles. What a clumsy scene! Licking his dry lips, Sillin muttered to himself, and suddenly there was some fear in his heart that he didn't want to admit. Yes, it was fear. Sillin boasted that his talent and strength were far beyond the experts of the younger generation. As long as he had a long spear in his hand, he was invincible. This was not narcissism, but a fact. But if he and Tang En were in the same position, he didn't think that he could compete with 3 void-level martial artists. He was afraid that one would be enough. But what he couldn't do, Tang En did it, and he did it very well. Right now, he also had the upper hand, and it seemed that winning was only a matter of time. Why? Is my talent not high enough, and I don't train hard enough? Or am I really not as good as him? Taking a deep breath, Sillin shook his head to get rid of the blank thoughts in his mind, gritted his teeth, and rushed forward again with the spear. But this time, the cold spear no longer gave him the confidence of invincibility. Chapter 951. Dilapidated bungalows, decaying courtyards, Thick layers of dust covered every corner. Unknown weeds grew everywhere, and occasionally there were a few swaying small white flowers, sticking their heads out to welcome the drizzle, washing away the dust. It was obvious that this was the most common abandoned house in the slums. And because it was dilapidated to a certain extent, even homeless people did not visit it, and there was no sign of life. The final fate of buildings like this was that they were destined to quietly collapse in a gust of wind or a rainy night, erasing all traces of their existence. Oh, that was not necessarily the case. At least at this time, this abandoned building welcomed a living creature, a wild dog that was so thin that it was only skin and bones, with many parts of its fur falling off. It quietly leaped in from a hole in the courtyard wall, tensing its muscles, stepping silently, turning its head from time to time. This wild dog appeared to be very vigilant and very careful. After all, it came out to look for food, and did not want to be treated as food. One must know that those starving two-legged creatures, to a certain extent, were much more terrifying than this wild dog. After a while, perhaps because it did not sense any danger, the wild dog's footsteps suddenly became lighter. It trotted around the courtyard, whimpering softly, officially announcing that this place was its safe territory. Of course, although territory was important, food was undoubtedly more important. After being happy for a while, the wild dog cast its gaze towards the dilapidated bungalows. Just as it was about to run in search of food, it suddenly seemed to sense something, and suddenly turned its head to look at the courtyard wall behind it, its eyes becoming vigilant again. Woof! Generally speaking, animals' perception of danger was stronger than humans, let alone a wild dog like this. With a cry, it abandoned the territory it had just occupied and quickly ran towards the hole it came from. The wild dog's reaction was not slow, but unfortunately, before it could run out of the courtyard, boom! The courtyard wall behind it suddenly exploded, as if it had been hit by a heavy hammer. In an instant, dust filled the air, and broken bricks flew everywhere, covering the courtyard and the desperate whimpers of the fleeing wild dog. No one cared about the life or death of a wild dog, especially in a situation where one's life could not be guaranteed. Just as the courtyard wall collapsed, whoosh, a tall figure rushed through the gray fog, the courtyard, and with a bang, crashed into the bungalow in a sorry state. Although the tall figure retreated in a sorry state, its speed was extremely fast. However, the figure that passed through the gray fog was even faster, like a ghost, accurately passing through the window of the bungalow, and instantly blocking in front of the tall figure. Bang bang bang. Too slow, too slow, too slow. You're really too slow. Fists and legs collided, and blades flashed wildly. After a few exchanges of blows, blood splattered everywhere, accompanied by a faint sigh. The ghostly figure that arrived later suddenly reached out and grabbed the tall figure's wrist. Elbowing, stepping, twisting his waist, swinging his arm, a series of actions were completed in an instant. With a bang, the tall figure that was thrown into the air smashed into the wall and fell back into the courtyard. Puff! As soon as he hit the ground, the tall figure immediately opened his mouth and spat out a large amount of blood. However, at this time, he had no time to care about his injuries. He rolled and stood up, waving his hands. Wait a minute, cough cough, why do you keep chasing me? Old Fay was really depressed now. The encirclement plan this time was proposed by Wensilin, and he was also the one who took the lead. Moreover, the only one who had a conflict with Tang En was Wensilin. However, ever since this Tang En took the initiative to attack, he had been treating him as his main target and would not let him go. In the end, the one who was hurt the most was him, the accomplice. What kind of logic was this? Why do they keep chasing you? Pushing open the broken wooden door of the house, Tang En scratched his head and walked out. He did not seem to have thought about this problem. Ah, I got it. Because you are very resistant. He clapped his hands and pointed at old Fay. Tang En gave a thumbs up to show his praise. Old Fei was dumbfounded when he heard this. He was indeed the strongest among them, and he was also the most resistant. This could be seen from the fact that Tang En's shadow doppelganger could not break his defense. Therefore, from this point of view, it was reasonable to capture the leader first to capture the bandit. Taking him, who was the strongest, first made sense. However, just because he had the best defense, he became the priority target, which inevitably made Old Fei even more depressed. Do you have any other questions? Or, do you still want to say something? Casually taking off the light knight's shoulder armor that was still hanging on his shoulder, Tang En raised his terrifying face that was half covered in blood and half covered in black ash, and said softly, "Last words are okay, but please try to be brief. You know, there is not much time." The corner of his mouth twitched, and after a moment of silence, Old Fei suddenly said, "If I leave here now, will you give up the chase?" Tang En raised his eyebrows when he heard this. Without waiting to think, a question of shock and anger suddenly came. "Old Fei, do you know what you are talking about?" Winston, with a face full of anger, walked in from the hole in the east wall of the courtyard, and then, the gray-clothed old man also appeared on the north wall. Without paying attention to Winston, Old Fei looked at Tang En and continued, "Think about it, the one who has a grudge with you is Winston, not us. To be honest, we just happened to be here at the right time. And 2 of us have already died. If you continue to fight like this, maybe you can win in the end, but it will definitely be a tragic victory. After all, we are void-level warriors." He pointed at the gray-clothed old man who seemed to be tempted, "And if you agree, I will leave with him now and not interfere in the grudge between you and Winston? How about it?" "TSK, sounds like a good suggestion." Touching his chin, Tang En turned his head and said, "Damn it. Old man, you." "I agree." Without looking at the furious Winston, the gray-clothed old man seemed to be scared. He simply nodded, and then his figure flashed, instantly disappearing from the top of the wall. After all, he was a void-level warrior. If Tang En didn't get close to him, it was still very easy for him to leave. He was using practical actions to show his determination to leave. Tang En didn't stop him. He just looked at the courtyard wall thoughtfully, then turned his head and looked at Winston with a smile that wasn't a smile. The latter was obviously beyond angry. He didn't understand why in just a short moment, Old Fei and the gray-clothed old man had the idea of betraying him, and in front of him, leave? "You 2 stupid old men, do you think that leaving will end this easily? Ridiculous. Think about my family, think about my sect. You came with me. If anything happens to me, can you stay out of it?" The more he spoke, the angrier he became. His expression was somewhat twisted. Winston stepped in front of Old Fei and pointed his finger at the old man's face. He gritted his teeth and said, "I'm telling you, you are dead. No matter how big the bran is, there is no place for you to hide. For the rest of your lives, you can only wink, wink for what? Do you still want to fight? Idiot!" His douchi flashed, and he suddenly pushed Winston away. Old Fei's expression was helpless and speechless. But between his lowered palms, at some point, a thick ice-blue douchi had gathered. Right at this moment, the abandoned house behind Twain suddenly exploded and collapsed, and a figure that was completely enveloped by an earthen yellow-colored battle aura was like a galloping chariot that rumbled madly as it dashed over. It was precisely the gray-clothed old man that had just left. And in front of Tang En, Old Fei, who had pushed Winston away, also rushed forward. His douchi was like a violent wave, covering the sky and the sun. One in front and one behind, the douchi was aimed at Tang En in the center. At this time, there was no need to say more. Betrayal was just an excuse for Old Fei and the gray-clothed old man to attack. There was no other way. In a mobile battle, Tang En's speed was too abnormal. They couldn't even lock onto the target, so how could they attack? But attacking from a fixed position was a different matter. As long as they locked onto Tang En's position and forced him to face them head-on, Old Fei and the gray-clothed old man didn't believe that with their years of accumulated dou qi, they wouldn't be able to defeat the young Tang En, but it was a pity. Winston, who had been blinded by the thought of betrayal, didn't have the intelligence to keep up. This caused a small flaw to appear in this perfect attack. Old Fei couldn't coordinate with the gray-clothed old man at the first moment. At that time, he was pushing Winston away. Of course, Old Fei could adjust to this momentary flaw. But then again, even Old Fei, who was judged as too slow, could react. So, there was no need to talk about Tang En. Tang En still had time to look at Winston, who was in a daze. He shook his head and laughed. "Ha, looks like you guys don't have good teamwork. Stupid teammates." After he finished speaking, boom, boom, boom. Chapter 952. P.S. The old home had a power outage again, and then you know what happened. Man, the leader of all things, was always intelligent, especially those old guys who grew with age. They were even more cunning. This was also an explanation for the saying, old people who don't die are thieves. As for examples, such as the current situation, seeing that they couldn't win with strength, and were even beaten up badly by Tang En, Old Fei decisively changed their strategy and played a trick, intending to win with wisdom and kill with one blow. It had to be said that to be able to make the usually arrogant and powerful void-level masters put down their pride and play a trick to attack together, it already showed the fear of Tang En in the hearts of Old Fei and Old Fei. Of course, this was not the main point. The main point was that in order to kill Tang En, Old Fei and Old Fei used all their strength, and the terrible consequences caused, in a short moment, the Yellow Chariot's dou qi and the Ice Blue Tide's dou qi successfully connected in the middle of the courtyard. This was inevitable. Since they used all their strength, even Old Fei and Old Fei couldn't easily stop in such a short distance, and they didn't dare to have the thought of stopping, because once there was a problem with the cooperation, they would die in the hands of the opposite side. So, no matter what the result was, they could only brace themselves and fight. Boom, 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 the thunder shook the world, and the moment the two colored dou qi collided, everyone's mind was buzzing, and they couldn't hear any other sound. The ground under their feet trembled, as if it was about to collapse. Even the drizzle that had been constantly falling seemed to be unable to withstand the terrifying power of this place, and took the initiative to avoid it, and disappeared in an instant. This was just the beginning. Then, a series of faint black ripples began to appear in the sky above the house, some big and some small, cutting through the void. At first glance, this side of the sky was like a rag that had been used for a long time, wrinkled and twisted, unusually strange and ugly. The few people present were all masters, so they naturally knew what the situation was. To put it simply, this sudden burst of terrifying power had already exceeded the limits of this space. So, the space began to collapse. The instant the spatial ripples appeared on the ground, a strange ring-shaped airwave with a diameter of over 30 meters appeared out of thin air and enveloped the abandoned house. Immediately after, the two colored light officially collided, and the strange ring-shaped air wave spread out, wave after wave. Looking at it with the naked eye, the spreading speed was not fast, but the power was catastrophic. He raised his line of sight and looked down. With the abandoned house as the center, wherever the airwaves swept past, the ground trembled, the houses trembled, and the walls of the alleys trembled. Everything was trembling and swaying non-stop, as if they were dancing to some unknown rhythm. Then, as he jumped, the wall fell, the house collapsed, and the ground cracked, spread, and continued to spread. Previously, because of Tang En's annoying close combat, Old Man Fei and Old Man Fei were unable to use their powerful battle chi. Now that he was finally able to use his full strength, he was naturally able to unleash this terrifying attack that was comparable to a natural disaster. But where was the target, which was Tang En? Oh, right now, he was standing in the corner of the courtyard, holding his chin and looking around, looking at the sky and the ground, while smacking his lips and sighing silently. It seemed like he was admiring something and was overflowing with interest. Perhaps it was similar to the principle that the center of the storm was the safest. The surrounding 100 meters had been reduced to a complete mess and was full of devastation. But this abandoned house, other than the place where Old Man Fei and Old Man Fei were fighting, was safe and sound. Standing on top of the ruins, not a single tile was broken. Thus, Tang En, who had successfully escaped in time and was now in the house, was naturally unharmed. It had to be said that this scene was really absurd, like a funny one-man show. It was also like on the battlefield. In order to defeat a powerful enemy, two allies formed a strategic alliance and made some pre-battle preparations, finally leading the other party into a trap. In the end, when the net was pulled, the enemy was gone, but they were fighting fiercely. Moreover, it was not just funny. Old Man Fei and Old Man Fei were undoubtedly experts, and an all-out attack from an expert was naturally not easy to take, even if the strength of both sides were about the same. Almost at the same time, pooh, less than 3 meters away, the trembling Old Man Fei and Old Man Fei suddenly opened their mouths and spat out large mouthfuls of blood. Even so, the two, whose expressions were slightly distorted, did not choose to stop. Just as they said before, they did not dare to stop. The dou qi that had gathered around the two had reached an extremely terrifying level, and it was not something they could control. Now, if one side stopped, they would be able to protect the other, but they would suffer a terrifying backlash and lie down as corpses. Outsiders like Tang En and Wen Silin also did not dare to interfere, because once they found an outlet, this terrifying power would surge out and cause devastating consequences. Of course, if the outsider was strong enough, for example, the sword god Wu Ding, there might be a perfect ending with a strong intervention. But of course this was impossible. There was only one sword god, and he was still sitting on a barren mountain outside the capital, so it was naturally impossible for him to come here. Excluding other things, the only safe way was to wait. When most of this terrifying power had been released and slowly subsided, Old Man Fei and Old Man Fei would retreat at the same time, and they should be able to minimize the damage from the backlash. As for now, the two could only look at each other and smile bitterly, and then compete to see who would vomit more blood. Okay. Crack, crack. Cracking his fingers, Tang En took a step forward in the strong wind, loosened his muscles, and looked at Wen Silin with a smile. It's rare that no one disturbs us, so I think we need to have a good chat. And what do you think? Wen Silin's expression changed when he heard this, and he subconsciously took a step back. Then, he felt that this action was too cowardly, so he retracted it again and glared back fiercely, provoking, "Okay, as long as you dare to come." Although his appearance was tough, Wen Silin could not help but feel nervous. He had now completely recognized the reality, and knew that he was no match for Tang En alone. Old Man Fei and Old Man Fei were now in a deadlock, and it was impossible for them to come and help him. He immediately regretted that he had been too stupid just now, and regretted that he had brought too few experts this time. Seeing Wen Silin's expression change in such a short time, Tang En naturally knew what he was thinking. He smiled and said no more. His figure flashed, and he disappeared from where he was. "You lunatic!" Wen Silin panicked when he saw this, and retreated until his back was against the wall of the courtyard. His provocation just now was not just to maintain his face. This courtyard was indeed extremely dangerous. If he was not careful, it could easily break the balance, and cause this abandoned courtyard to follow in the footsteps of the ruins last time, and not even a speck of dust would remain. But Tang En did not care at all. Even without the help of blood energy, dou qi, and other powers, Tang En was confident that he could beat Wen Silin to a pulp with just his fists and legs. And the reality was indeed so. He flashed in an instant, and simply punched towards Wensillen's face. You know what? You make me a little jealous. Wensillen decisively abandoned his spear, which was useless in close combat. He did not have time to think about what his opponent was jealous of. He swung his elbow to parry, and with a bang, his right knee quietly and viciously pushed forward. As the disciple of the god of swords, Wensillen's strength was naturally not limited to weapons. His fists and legs were not weak either, but he did not use them often. Unfortunately, he had met Tang En this time. Tang En did not know any other world's fists and legs, but his eyesight was brilliant and he was fast. It was enough to have these advantages. As if he had expected this, he lifted his leg and pressed down, easily removing the knee strike. Look, you have a good background, good luck, and good talent. He turned his fist into a palm, and then his palm into a blade. He slashed down diagonally, and with a hiss, he cut through Wensillen's bent elbow defense. He stepped forward and swung his fist. Especially your appearance, it really makes people want to beat you up when they see you. Bang! With a muffled grunt, Wensillen's body was instantly sent flying, and a white tooth spun into the air. He chased after him again. Tang En frowned slightly and sighed faintly. I don't understand. Since the heavens love you so much and practically let you have everything, why are you still not satisfied? He took half a step back and parried Wensillen's heavy punch, which was pouncing on him like a tiger. Why are you still provoking me? Don't you know that I have a bad temper? When I'm angry, even I'm afraid of myself. He flicked his wrist slightly and reached out. Like a butterfly flying through flowers, he passed through the heavy punches and grabbed Wensillen's collar. He turned around and threw him to the ground. Boom! Chapter 953. A large number of facts had proven that the warriors of the other world were indeed not good at close combat and martial arts. Of course, this was also a normal situation. The other world was not the modern world. Here there was Do Qi, a unique power that could overturn mountains and seas and cause large-scale damage. So, who would go and painstakingly practice some martial arts? Just like when a longbow and a machine gun were placed in front of you, even an ordinary person with no combat experience would know to choose the machine gun. This was an inevitable choice. But Tang En, a different person from the modern world, came to this other world with a unique assassin system. And now, it was a narrow space where he could not use Do Qi and there was nowhere to hide. So, Wensillen was in a tragedy. In terms of real strength, Wensillen was not Tang En's opponent. And in terms of martial arts, he was more than 3 streets ahead of him. As soon as they started fighting, it was a one-sided crushing scene. Furthermore, Tang En was so despicable. Well, it could also be jealousy. He did not know the rule of not hitting someone in the face. 8 out of 10 punches were aimed at Wensillen's handsome face. The peach blossoms bloomed brilliantly. In a short while, Wensillen's appearance completely changed. His cheeks were swollen, his eyes were dark, the corners of his mouth were crooked, and his face was green and red. Even if his mother was here, she would not be able to recognize that this pig head was her handsome and carefree precious son. What's wrong with you? Kill me. SSS. Your F***king killing me? Your F***king killing me. His mouth leaked air, and the same sentence was said with 2 different meanings. Wensillen, who was lying on the ground, had never been so humiliated. At first, he was still protecting his vital parts, but later, he vaguely understood that the other party did not intend to immediately take his life, but intended to continuously humiliate him. His psychological defense immediately collapsed. Silly. Silly for what? Slightly stunned, Tang En could not help but give him a thumbs up. Good. You're manly enough, a real man. But you still dare to scold me like this, looks like I went easy on you. After saying that, he leaned over and punched. SSS. What's wrong with you? No, no. Kill me, kill me. F***ck. You want to compete with me? Are you addicted to scolding me? Flustered and exasperated, he raised his leg and kicked furiously. Japanese wine. Your mother? F***ck. I finally understand. You're courting death. What a farce. Tangen did not seem to have any intention of taking Wenson's life immediately. Therefore, even though the latter had a pig's head and was screaming in pain, most of his injuries were just external injuries. At most, he had a few broken ribs. It was not a big deal. However, there was no longer any suspense about the outcome of this battle. Winston's life was in Tangen's hands, and it could be decided in a matter of seconds. Seeing this situation, Old Man Fei and Old Man Fei looked at each other with bitterness in their eyes. As if he had decided on something, Old Fei's gaze turned resolute as he stared at the gray-robed old man. The latter was silent for a moment before he nodded gently. Just as when Seelan said earlier, Old Fei and Old Man Fei couldn't just watch when Seelan die in front of them. Otherwise, even if they managed to escape, they wouldn't be able to withstand the mountain-like pressure from the One Seelan family and their sect. Therefore, they could only choose to save him. At this time, a lot of the terrifying do-chi between the two had already been released. Of course, there was still a lot left. At this time, it was not impossible for them to withdraw and attack, but they would have to pay a price. However, they didn't have a choice, right? After making up their minds, Old Fei and Old Man Fei suddenly shouted and took a step to the side with tacit understanding. They both withdrew their right hands. As soon as they left, the two-colored do-chi flickered and suddenly fluctuated, as if it would explode in the next moment. This strange movement caused Old Fei and Old Man Fei's bodies to sway non-stop. Both of them spat out large amounts of blood. Their faces were ashen, and it was as if they had aged 10 years in an instant. However, even so, Old Fei and Old Man Fei's left palms were still as steady as a rock. They fiercely slapped one side of the two-colored do-chi. Whoosh! Like a flood that opened a gate, like a dam that was about to collapse, the two-colored do-chi instantly fell to one side. It was like a snow-white blade, and also like a line of fatal ripples that spread out in an unstoppable manner. The direction of the ripples of the blade was precisely where Tangen was. If it swept past, Tangen would definitely be cut in half at the waist. As for Wen Silin, he would be able to luckily escape this calamity because he was holding his head with both hands and lying on the ground. However, as long as Tangen was in battle, he would be able to keep his eyes and ears open to all directions. Of course, he would not be so easily hit. In reality, when Old Fei and Old Man Fei were shouting, Tangen simply leaped over the courtyard wall with a trail of afterimages and disappeared. Puff! In a short breath, the ripples swept past, and the only intact courtyard wall that was still standing was like a pile of flour. It instantly turned into ashes, and the spectacular ruins behind it were revealed. At the same time, Old Fei and Old Man Fei both let out a muffled groan. Their left palms that were pushing the two-colored do-chi suddenly trembled violently. Their skin, flesh, and bones layer by layer, they completely melted away at a speed visible to the naked eye. It was a shocking sight. Not only that, after more than half of their arms had melted away, the backlash continued to spread to their chests and necks. Roar! A large amount of blood spilled out. Old Fei and Old Man Fei roared like a tiger and decisively retreated. Then, they quickly rushed forward. Let's go! They grabbed Wen Silin's lapels and ran out in the opposite direction with the other gray-clothed old man. They quickly left this abandoned courtyard. This time, they were truly retreating. Old Fei and Old Man Fei did not think that this attack would be able to kill Tangen. Perhaps the power of the two-colored do-chi was enough, but it would be useless if they could not catch up to him in speed. Therefore, they only wanted to use this opportunity to force Tangen away and buy more time to retreat. And in fact, they had indeed done it. However, this so-called retreat also had a condition, young Master Wensilin, this is all that we two old men can do. As they flew away, Old Fei's expression was solemn as he said solemnly, next we will split up and leave it to fate. No one wanted to die, and the older they were, the more afraid they were of death. Old Fei and Old Man Fei were very clear that although they had temporarily forced Tang En away, with the other party's teleportation technique, it would not take long for him to easily catch up. And the one who had a grudge with Tang En was only Wensilin. Therefore, if they ran with Wensilin, they would definitely die. The only thing they could do now was to split up and escape. Only then could they protect themselves. Of course, they could not be blamed for being heartless. In fact, they had indeed done what they could. Not to mention anything else, just to save Wensilin from Tang En's hands, Old Fei and Old Man Fei had paid an extremely painful price. Not only did they lose an arm that could never be recovered, but they also suffered serious internal injuries caused by the backlash of their dou qi. It wasn't an exaggeration to say that after this matter, their cultivation realms would definitely fall, their lifespans would also suffer quite a bit of damage. Looking at it from a different perspective, this price would also be enough for them to confidently face the blame and pressure of the Wensilin family and their masters when they returned. Hiss hiss. What do you mean? Wensilin obviously had not completely recovered from the humiliation just now. His teeth were leaking as he asked in a daze. Old Fei saw this and sighed softly. He did not open his mouth to explain. A mocking laugh suddenly came from afar. Haha, IQ is a shortcoming. It really is a sad thing. Idiot. Is it not obvious enough? They are going to abandon you and run away. Their expressions changed greatly. Old Fei and Old Man Fei suddenly turned their heads and saw that the nightmarish figure of the devil had already appeared in the abandoned house behind them. This speed was too abnormal. They both groaned in despair in their hearts. Old Fei and Old Man Fei looked at each other. They no longer had any thoughts of leaving things to chance. They suddenly pushed Wensilin and quickly scattered to the left and right. They looked up to the sky and roared, "Run!" With the push of Old Fei and Old Man Fei, Wensilin's speed was as fast as a ghost. In an instant, he had left the abandoned field that was more than 1,000 feet under his feet. The whistling of the wind in his ears finally woke him up completely. He understood the situation at hand and immediately cried out, "Don't abandon me! Come back, come back!" Of course, Old Fei and the old man would not go back to court death. Instead, they watched as the two one-armed figures on the left and right quickly left their line of sight. Ha ha! Tang En stood in the abandoned house and nodded, chuckling with satisfaction. He did not chase after them, nor would he chase after them. In fact, from the moment Tang En took the initiative to attack, he did not have much hope of killing Old Fei and Old Man Fei. He only wanted to scare them away. After all, they were void-level powerhouses. If it was a one-on-one fight, Tang En was confident that he could make them all stay. For example, Anqilua and the chubby Old Man Fei. But if the three of them attacked together, Tang En would not be able to do it. The chaotic battle just now also proved this point. If Tang En went all out, he could take the initiative and even gain a small advantage. But if he wanted to really win, it would not be so easy. At least, it was not something that could be done in a short time without paying a price. What's more, if the void-level powerhouses saw that the situation was not good and wanted to retreat, Tang En really could not stop them. At most, he could only make one of them stay. In this way, there was naturally no need to continue the battle. It was also because he knew this point that Tang En changed his style of sneak attacks. Storm, Shadow Doppelganger, Permetha Teleportation, and other big moves were used one after another. He was strong and aggressive, taking the initiative to attack. Sometimes, he did not even hesitate to exchange injury for injury, crazily attacking. He successfully created a psychological illusion for Old Fei and the others, infinitely increasing Tang En's strength, gradually reducing their chances of winning. They only felt that the opponent was unfathomable. If they continued to fight, they would very likely die here like their previous two companions. When humans think, God laughs. They were not afraid of not thinking, but they were afraid of thinking too much. With such negative thoughts piling up, Old Faye and Old Man Faye lost the confidence to fight. Of course, there was also Wensillen's contribution. With such a pig teammate, it was hard to have any confidence in winning well. The details were really subtle and complicated. To put it simply, Tang Yin's plan succeeded. He successfully scared away the two void-level powerhouses. Now, he could not be disturbed and have a good chat with the victim who would not let go, which was Wensillen. He had been looking forward to that scene for a long time. You're tuning in to the Phoenix Knights YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.